Everything you know about human history is a lie told to keep you calm. Humanity did not rise once from the Stone Age. We rose 7 times, and 6 times before this moment, we were erased. In 1912, a coal miner in Oklahoma broke open a seam 300 million years old. Inside, he found a metal cube. Perfect edges, machined surfaces, right angles that nature cannot create. The Smithsonian took it for analysis. Within a year, the artifact was lost. No photographs, no paper trail. Gone. In 1968, divers off the coast of Japan discovered stone terraces descending into darkness, parallel steps, carved channels, geometric precision across acres of seafloor. The site was mapped, photographed, dated to the end of the last ice age. Then, the Japanese government closed the area, research permits denied, sonar data classified. This is not one anomaly. This is a pattern. Across the planet, evidence is disappearing. Objects sealed in coal that should not exist. Drowned cities beneath 400 feet of water. Genetic markers in your DNA that make no sense unless your ancestors survived catastrophes. Flood myths from cultures that never met, describing the same darkness, the same rising water, the same survivors fleeing to mountains. And here is what should concern you most. The forces that erased 6 civilizations are not ancient history. They are returning, right now. The magnetic field is weakening, ice sheets are fracturing, storms are intensifying, ocean currents are slowing. Carbon dioxide levels exceed anything seen throughout known human civilization. These are not political talking points. These are measurements, warning signs written in the same language that marked the end of every cycle before ours. You are not here by accident. Men of experience understand when something does not add up. You have built careers, raised families, navigated decades of change. You have learned to trust your instincts. And your instincts are telling you something is wrong with the official story. The timeline has cracks. The explanations feel incomplete. Maybe you have stood at ancient monuments wondering how copper tools created such precision. Maybe you have read flood myths and noticed they are too similar to be coincidence. Maybe you simply sense that something larger is moving beneath the surface, something we are not being told. Tonight we are going to walk straight into those cracks, not for entertainment, not for speculation, but because understanding what destroyed 6 civilizations is the only way to see what is coming for us. This is an investigation grounded in geology, archaeology, genetics, and physical evidence that institutions have worked quietly to remove from public view. Artifacts cataloged and then lost. Underwater ruins photographed and then classified. Genetic studies published and then retracted. Researchers who asked uncomfortable questions and watched their careers destroyed. The images you see are only guides for your imagination. If you prefer, close your eyes. Let the words build the pictures. This is designed to meet you wherever you are, in whatever hour keeps you company, whether you are seeking answers or simply seeking rest. Here is my promise. If you stay until the end, you will see the pattern that connects them all, the hidden timeline beneath accepted history. You will understand why megalithic structures across oceans share identical engineering techniques, why your DNA carries markers from ancestors who survived catastrophes, why cultures separated by continents tell the same flood stories, and most importantly, why this matters right now. The path ahead divides into 7 investigations, artifacts sealed in impossible time, cycles in ice cores repeating every 90,000 years, global flood myths as trauma memories, drowned kingdoms sleeping beneath the waves, your genetic code carrying survival instructions, monuments encoding astronomical knowledge, and finally, the 6 forgotten civilizations that rose before ours and were erased when the world reset. By the end, you will understand what they tried to preserve and why the cycle is returning. If you are listening right now, if something inside you knows this story matters, recognizes the gaps in the official timeline, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming, and save this video to your playlist so you can watch it again later. Because this video is one of many journeys exploring hidden timelines. Each episode will reveal another layer of evidence, another connection between ancient catastrophes and modern warnings. We are the seventh civilization. That is not metaphor. That is conclusion drawn from evidence scattered across every continent and ocean floor. 6 times before us, humanity rose to heights we can barely imagine. 6 times, the world reset. 6 times, survivors carried fragments into the future, fragments that became the seeds from which we grew, never knowing we were not the first, never suspecting the cycle would return. The deeper we go, the more one truth becomes unavoidable. We are not separate from this story. We are inside it. The instincts you feel, the unease you sense, those are genetic memories activating. Your ancestors lived through the end of worlds, and now their code is waking up, responding to signals that match conditions before collapse. So take a breath, settle in, and step with me into the first mystery. We begin with artifacts that should not exist, objects sealed in stone millions of years before humans supposedly evolved. We begin with the proof they tried to erase. We begin now. Chapter 1. Out-of-place artifacts. The evidence sealed in stone. You are standing in a coal mine in Oklahoma. The year is 1912, and the air around you is thick with dust that catches in your throat and coats your skin with black powder that will not wash clean for days. The tunnel stretches ahead into darkness, broken only by the weak glow of oil lamps hanging from wooden beams that creak under the weight of 300 feet of earth pressing down from above. The smell is ancient, organic, the compressed remnants of forests that fell and rotted and were buried during the Carboniferous period, back when the continents were still drifting into position, back when the ancestors of dinosaurs had not yet evolved, back when nothing remotely human walked anywhere on this planet. You are here because coal means heat. Heat means survival through winter, and survival means descending into the ground to extract compressed plant matter that died 300 million years ago. You swing your pick into the seam, the impact sending vibrations up your arms, jarring your shoulders, and the coal splits open the way it always does, black and brittle and ancient. But this time, something else is there. Something that catches the lamplight, something that should not exist. Your hand reaches into the gap and closes around metal. Not a fossil, not a concretion, not iron pyrite or any mineral formation you have seen in 10 years of working these tunnels. Metal. Solid. Cold. Deliberate. You pull it free and hold it up to the lamplight, turning it slowly, and what you see makes no sense at all. A cube. Perfectly formed, each edge straight and true, each corner meeting at a precise right angle. The surface is smooth, machined, deliberately created with a level of precision that speaks of measurement and tools and intent. This is not something that formed naturally. This is not something that could have been made by wind or water or geological pressure or the slow grinding of time. This is something someone built. But the coal around it, the coal you just broke open with your own hands, is 300 million years old. You stand there in the lamplight, other miners gathering around you, their faces smudged with coal dust, their eyes reflecting the same confusion you feel. This object is impossible. The timeline does not allow for it. Human civilization is supposed to be 12,000 years old at most. Metalworking maybe 6,000. precision machining, a few centuries. Yet here in your hand is an object that was sealed inside coal before the first mammals evolved, before the first flowers bloomed, before the continents took their current shape. Someone made this. Someone with knowledge of geometry and metallurgy. Someone who existed in a time that should contain nothing but ferns and primitive amphibians. You take the cube to the surface. You show it to the mine supervisor. Word spreads through the camp. A representative from the Smithsonian Institution arrives within weeks, examines the object with instruments and calipers, takes detailed notes, asks about the exact location and depth of the discovery, promises a full metallurgical analysis and a published report, and then disappears back east with the cube carefully wrapped and crated and labeled. You wait for the report. Weeks pass, months, a year. You write letters to the Smithsonian, polite inquiries about the status of the analysis. No response. You write again, more insistent. Silence. You try to follow up through other channels, contacting local universities, newspapers, anyone who might know what happened to your discovery. The answer, when it finally comes, is brief and dismissive. The artifact has been lost, misplaced during a transfer between departments. No photographs were taken before it vanished. No detailed analysis was ever conducted. No paper trail exists beyond the initial intake form. The cube simply disappeared into the archives of one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world, and within a generation, almost no one remembers it existed at all. You die decades later, still wondering what you found. Still certain that what you held in your hand that day was proof of something extraordinary, something that challenged everything you were taught about the age and origin of human civilization. And you were right, but the world was not ready to hear it. This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern that repeats across continents and across decades with a consistency that should trouble anyone paying attention. The Oklahoma cube is only one thread in a tapestry of impossible objects, artifacts that appear where they should not, in layers of earth that predate humanity by spans of time so vast they make recorded history feel like a breath. In 1844, 70 years before the Oklahoma discovery, workers breaking apart coal for a furnace in Pennsylvania find a brass bell embedded inside a lump of coal dated to 320 million years ago. The bell is small, ornate, with a decorative handle suggesting deliberate artistic intent. It is not crude. It is not primitive. It shows signs of casting in a mold, of metalwork that requires heat and technique and understanding of alloy composition. The coal around it took longer to form than human beings have existed, yet there it sits, impossible and undeniable. In 1851, workers quarrying stone in Dorchester, Massachusetts, split open solid rock and watch as a metal vase falls out from the center of the block. The vase is beautiful, ornate, made from an alloy of zinc and silver, inlaid with decorative flourishes that speak of culture and aesthetic sensibility. The rock that encased it predates any known human civilization by geological epochs. The workers bring it to the local museum. It is displayed for a time, written about in regional newspapers, examined by visiting scholars who struggle to explain how such an object could exist in stone millions of years old. Then, quietly, it disappears from the museum's collection. No record of its removal, no explanation, just gone. In 1885, workers in a coal mine in Austria break open a seam and discover an iron cube, each face perfectly smooth, each edge meeting at angles that nature does not create. The cube is sent to the mining authority, photographed, documented. The photograph survives. The cube does not. Lost during transport, whereabouts unknown. In 1912, the same year as the Oklahoma discovery, employees at a municipal power plant break apart coal for the furnaces and discover an iron pot sealed inside the seam. The pot shows no signs of rust, despite being surrounded by conditions that should have corroded iron into dust millions of years ago. The metal is analyzed and found to be of unusually high purity, higher than what 19th century smelting could reliably produce. The pot is sent to a university for further study. It never arrives. Lost in transit. No follow-up. No investigation into how a university shipment simply vanishes. The pattern repeats. A machined metal sphere discovered in South Africa, embedded in strata dated to 2.8 billion years old. A metallic screw-like object found in Russia, its threads perfectly uniform, sealed in rock that should predate multicellular life. A spark plug-like component discovered in California in 1961, encased in a geode dated to 500,000 years old. X-rays reveal its internal structure, a ceramic core surrounded by a hexagonal metal casing, with what appears to be a spring mechanism still intact inside. These are not crude tools. These are not simple stones shaped by erosion or geological accident. These are machined objects showing signs of precision manufacturing, objects that require metallurgy, engineering, planning, and technology that, according to every accepted timeline, should not exist for hundreds of millions of years. Official explanations arrive like clockwork, delivered with confidence that does not quite mask the discomfort beneath. Contamination, they say. The objects must have fallen into cracks in the rock and only appeared to be sealed inside. But the coal seams show no cracks. The rock shows no fractures. The objects are found at depths where contamination is impossible. Misidentification, they suggest. What looks like metal is actually a mineral formation, marcasite or pyrite, that coincidentally resembles manufactured objects. But metallurgical analysis proves these are alloys, combinations of metals that do not occur naturally, that require smelting and intentional mixing. Hoax, they conclude. Someone planted these items to deceive, to gain attention, to disrupt the accepted narrative. And sometimes, in isolated cases, those explanations hold weight. Contamination happens, misidentification occurs, hoaxes exist. People lie. People seek fame. People make mistakes. But when the pattern repeats across different countries, different decades, different discoverers who have no connection to each other and no apparent motive to lie, when metallurgical analysis reveals alloys that should not exist in nature, when geological surveys confirm the dating of surrounding material, when X-rays show internal mechanisms too complex to be accidents of mineralization, the explanations begin to feel less like science and more like deflection, less like honest inquiry and more like institutional protection of a narrative that cannot accommodate these objects without collapsing. You try to imagine the meeting, the quiet conversation in some back office at the Smithsonian or a university archive, where a curator looks at the Oklahoma cube or the Dorchester vase or the Austrian iron, reads the geological report confirming the age of the surrounding material, understands the implications of publishing this finding, and realizes that moving forward would require rewriting textbooks, challenging the careers of senior researchers, admitting that the timeline everyone has built their professional reputation upon might be fundamentally flawed. Easier to lose the artifact, easier to file it incorrectly, easier to let it gather dust in an unmarked drawer while the world moves on, unburdened by questions that have no comfortable answers. This is not malice. This is not conspiracy in the dramatic sense, with shadowy figures meeting in secret to suppress truth. This is something more mundane and more powerful. This is institutional inertia, the enormous weight of established knowledge resisting anything that threatens its foundation, and that resistance is more effective than any coordinated cover-up, because it operates through individual choices made by people protecting careers, reputations, funding streams, and the comfortable certainty that comes from knowing the accepted story. But the Earth does not care about institutional comfort. The Earth keeps yielding its secrets. In coal mines and quarries and construction sites around the world, objects continue to emerge from layers that should contain only stone and compressed organic matter. Workers drilling foundations for buildings in China unearth bronze gears sealed in rock dated to millions of years. Road construction crews in India break open stone and find metal objects with symmetrical holes and machined surfaces. Deep mining operations in South America encounter spherical objects with grooved surfaces emerging from strata that predate human evolution by geological ages. And while most of these discoveries disappear into the same bureaucratic void that swallowed the Oklahoma Cube, a few survive long enough to be photographed, analyzed by independent researchers, documented in journals that exist outside the mainstream academic apparatus. These survivors whisper a possibility that establishment science refuses to entertain. Someone before us reached a level of technological sophistication we assume belongs only to the modern era. Someone worked metal, created precision instruments, manufactured objects with purpose and skill and understanding of materials science. And then they were gone, erased so completely that only these fragments remain, sealed in stone like messages in bottles cast into an ocean of time, waiting for the moment when humanity would dig deep enough to find them and brave enough to ask what they mean. The deeper you examine the pattern, the stranger it becomes. These artifacts do not appear randomly scattered across geological time. They cluster in specific periods, moments when the Earth was undergoing massive upheaval, when volcanic activity spiked worldwide, when ocean levels shifted dramatically, when climates transformed with brutal speed from ice to warmth or warmth to ice. It is as though each wave of discovery corresponds to a moment of catastrophic change, a reset event that buried entire landscapes under layers of volcanic ash and sediment and rising water, preserving whatever lay on the surface at the moment of collapse. If civilizations rose during the stable periods between these cataclysms, thrived for thousands of years, developed technologies we would recognize as advanced, and were then destroyed during the transitions, their remains would be found exactly where we are finding them, sealed in the geological layers that mark the boundaries between ages, waiting in the darkness for someone to break open the rock and ask the questions no one wants asked. The geological record supports this interpretation. The boundary layers between epochs show signs of sudden, violent change. Ash deposits from megavolcanic eruptions that darkened skies for years. Iridium anomalies suggesting asteroid impacts. Rapid shifts in ocean chemistry indicating massive die-offs. Evidence of flooding on scales that would have drowned coastal civilizations in a matter of decades, as ice sheets collapsed and sea levels rose 400 feet. These are not gradual transitions, these are reset events. Moments when the world changed so dramatically that anything built upon its surface would be buried, compressed, fossilized, sealed away from light and air and memory. What makes this pattern even more unsettling is the response from the scientific establishment. Not to individual artifacts, which can always be dismissed or explained away, but to the pattern itself. Researchers who focus too intently on out-of-place artifacts find themselves marginalized. Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre, a geologist working in Mexico, used multiple dating methods to determine that artifacts at Hueyatlaco were 250,000 years old, far older than humans were supposed to exist in the Americas. Her findings were rejected. Her funding was cut. Her career was effectively ended. She was not discredited for bad methodology. Her techniques were sound. She was discredited for arriving at a conclusion that contradicted the accepted timeline. Dr. Michael Cremo spent decades cataloging anomalous artifacts, compiling a massive database of objects found in impossible contexts. His work is exhaustive, well-documented, meticulously sourced. Mainstream archaeology ignores it entirely, not because his evidence is flawed, but because engaging with it would require reopening settled questions, and settled questions are what allow careers to progress smoothly. The pattern continues. Funding dries up for researchers who pursue forbidden timelines. Peer review becomes hostile. Publications that once welcomed their work suddenly find reasons to reject submissions. University positions evaporate. Invitations to conferences stop arriving. The message is clear without ever being stated directly. Do not pursue this line of inquiry. Do not threaten the timeline. Do not ask questions that might unravel decades of accepted knowledge and make senior professors look foolish for having taught certainties that were never certain at all. And most researchers, understandably, copy. They have families to feed, mortgages to pay, students to mentor, reputations to protect. So they turn their attention to safer topics, and the artifacts remain in unmarked drawers, and the pattern remains unexamined by anyone with institutional backing and mainstream credibility. But some refuse to look away. Independent researchers, retired academics no longer beholden to departmental politics, amateur investigators with nothing to lose and everything to gain from finding truth. They continue cataloging these objects, building databases, connecting discoveries across continents and time periods, publishing in alternative journals and online platforms where peer review comes from interested readers rather than gatekeeping committees. And what they find is undeniable. The artifacts exist. The metallurgical analyses are sound. The geological dating is consistent across multiple methods. The objects are real. They are old, and they should not be there. Which means one of two things. Either our understanding of geological dating is fundamentally flawed, which would overturn entire fields of science and render useless decades of research, or objects created by intelligent beings were sealed into rock millions of years before humans supposedly evolved from earlier hominids in Africa. Neither option is comfortable. Both require rethinking everything we believe about our place in time, our uniqueness as a species, our assumption that technological civilization is a recent and unprecedented development. And that is precisely why the pattern of suppression continues, not because of evil intent or coordinated conspiracy, but because accepting these artifacts as genuine would mean admitting that the story we tell ourselves about human progress, about our journey from caves to cities, about our special place in the history of this planet, is incomplete at best and entirely wrong at worst. Perhaps the most important question is not whether these artifacts are real. The evidence, when examined without institutional bias, suggests they are. The question is what they represent. If earlier civilizations rose to technological sophistication and were then erased by catastrophic events, how many cycles have there been? How far back does this pattern extend? The artifacts span hundreds of millions of years, suggesting not one or two prior civilizations, but potentially dozens, each rising during stable periods, each developing its own technologies, each leaving fragments that survive the reset by chance rather than design. And if the pattern extends that far back, if the Earth has hosted wave after wave of intelligence and complexity, each believing itself unique and permanent, each destroyed by forces it did not anticipate or could not control, then what does that mean for us now, standing at a moment when the Earth shows every sign of approaching another transition, another upheaval, another reset that will bury our works under new layers of sediment and leave only scattered traces for whatever comes after to discover and puzzle over, and perhaps, like us, choose to ignore, because the implications are too vast and too terrifying to accept. The artifacts sealed in stone are not just evidence of the past. They are warnings about the future. They are proof that nothing is permanent, that no level of advancement guarantees survival, that the Earth has its own rhythms, and those rhythms do not care about human ambition or human achievement. 6 times before, or perhaps many more times than 6, someone stood where we stand now, believing themselves secure, confident in their technologies, certain that their civilization would endure. 6 times they were wrong. The coal seams and rock strata bear witness to their failure, and the cube you held in that mine in 1912, the vase that fell from Massachusetts stone, the iron pot from Austria, the sphere from South Africa, these are their voices, reaching across impossible spans of time, asking one question that echoes through the ages. Will you listen? Or will you, like the institutions that buried this evidence in unmarked drawers, choose comfort over truth, certainty over inquiry, the known story over the unknown reality that threatens to overturn everything? The choice belongs to each person who encounters this evidence. You can dismiss it, as mainstream science has done, as anomalies and hoaxes and misidentifications. You can file it away mentally the same way museums file away the artifacts physically, stored but ignored, present but not examined. Or you can let it change the way you see history, the way you understand human capability, the way you evaluate our current moment and the forces gathering around us. Because these objects are not isolated curiosities. They are data points in a pattern, fragments of a larger truth that reveals itself only when you step back far enough to see the whole shape. And that shape is cyclical. That shape is repetition. That shape is rise and fall, construction and destruction, memory and forgetting, played out across scales of time that make our recorded history feel like the blink of an eye. We are not the first. We are not unique. We are not exempt from the forces that turned those earlier civilizations into coal and stone and silence. And the artifacts, patient and persistent, wait in the darkness to remind us of that truth. Are you starting to see the pattern? Can you feel the ground shifting beneath the accepted timeline, the comfortable story that says we rose from nothing and climbed steadily toward enlightenment? The artifacts tell a different story. They tell a story of cycles, of civilizations that rose before us, reached heights we barely understand, and then vanished so completely that only these fragments remain, sealed in impossible time, waiting to be discovered by people brave enough to ask uncomfortable questions. If this evidence resonates with you, if you sense that the official narrative has cracks wide enough to see through, then let others know by leaving a like on this video. That simple action helps the algorithm understand that people are hungry for investigations like this, for content that does not shy away from difficult truths. And it guides others who are searching for the same answers to find their way here. We are building something together, a community of people who understand that the surface story is not the whole story, and your engagement is what makes that community visible. Because what comes next takes us deeper into the pattern. We have seen the objects sealed in stone, the physical evidence that someone came before. But artifacts alone do not explain the rhythm of collapse. They do not explain why civilizations fall. For that, we need to look at the Earth itself, at the cycles hidden in ice cores and ocean sediments, at the geological record that reveals a pattern of catastrophic change repeating every 90 to 100,000 years, like a clock ticking in stone and ice. The next chapter takes us into that rhythm, into the cyclical timeline that mainstream science acknowledges but refuses to connect with human history. We are going to examine the evidence that the Earth resets itself, that stability is temporary, that the forces which destroyed earlier civilizations are not ancient history, but active processes that continue to this moment. The artifacts were the proof. The cycle is the mechanism. And understanding that mechanism is the only way to see what is coming for us now. The path continues, and the evidence grows stronger with every step. Stay with me as we descend into the rhythm of collapse, into the pattern that connects ice ages and volcanic winters, and floods that reshaped continents, into the hidden timeline that reveals we are not at the beginning of human achievement, but standing somewhere in the middle of a story far older and far more fragile than we have been taught to believe. The next mystery awaits, and it will change everything you think you know about time, about civilization, and about the ground beneath your feet. Chapter 2. the cyclical timeline. Rise, fall, silence, repeat. You are standing on an ice sheet in Antarctica, surrounded by endless white silence that extends in every direction until earth and sky become indistinguishable, and the cold is not the surface cold of winter, but something deeper, something that reaches through your clothing and into your bones, the cold of a place where human warmth has no meaning and never will. In your hands, wrapped in protective cloth to keep your skin from freezing to its surface, you hold a cylinder of ice drilled from thousands of feet below where you stand. This core sample represents time made visible, each layer a year, each subtle shift in color or texture a record of what the atmosphere held when that snow fell and compacted into ice. You can see them with your naked eye if you look closely enough, the thin, dark bands that mark volcanic eruptions, the pale sections that indicate periods of heavy snow, the transitions between ice ages and the warm periods between them. This cylinder holds 200,000 years of Earth's memory, and you are the first person to see it since it formed, layer by patient layer, in darkness and pressure and cold. You run your gloved fingers along the surface, feeling the subtle ridges where one year ends and another begins, and you understand that what you hold is not just frozen water, but a library, a record kept by the planet itself, without bias or agenda, or any concern for how its data might be interpreted by the creatures who eventually learn to read it. The ice remembers everything. It remembers the composition of ancient atmospheres, the temperature shifts that happened in spans shorter than a human lifetime, the ash that fell when supervolcanoes erupted half a world away, the dust from asteroid impacts that darkened skies for years. Every breath of wind that blew across this continent for the last 200 millennia left its chemical signature in the snow that fell. And that snow, compressed and preserved, now tells a story that makes the comfortable narrative of steady human progress feel like a pleasant fiction told to children who are not yet ready for harder truths. You carry the core sample into the research station, a small cluster of heated buildings that feels impossibly fragile against the vast emptiness surrounding it. And you lay the cylinder on an examination table under lights bright enough to reveal every detail. Other researchers gather around, their faces showing the mixture of exhaustion and excitement that comes from working at the edge of the world in conditions that want you dead. Someone begins marking the core with measurements, noting the depths that correspond to known historical events, volcanic eruptions that left traces in ice thousands of miles from their source, temperature shifts that match written records from civilizations that kept careful chronicles of droughts and floods and years when crops failed and people starved. And then someone points to a section deeper in the core, a black band thin as a pencil line, and says the words that change everything. This layer marks a moment 200,000 years ago when something catastrophic happened, when volcanic ash fell so thick it buried entire ecosystems, when temperatures dropped so fast that the transition shows up as a sharp line rather than a gradual fade, when the world, as it existed in one season, became unrecognizable by the next. But here is what makes your hands go still and your breath catch. This is not the only black line. The core is full of them, thin, dark bands appearing with disturbing regularity, each one marking a moment of catastrophic change, each one spaced roughly 90 to 100,000 years apart, stretching back through the ice like a clock ticking in stone and frozen water. The pattern is undeniable. The Earth resets itself, not randomly, not occasionally, but rhythmically, predictably, with a consistency that suggests these events are not anomalies, but features of how this planet operates. Cycles as fundamental as seasons, but playing out across spans of time so vast that recorded human history fits between two ticks of the clock with room to spare. And you stand there, looking at the evidence, feeling the cold from the ice seeping through your gloves, and you understand that if this pattern holds, If the Earth truly operates on a cycle of stability followed by catastrophic change, then every civilization that ever rose during the stable periods would have been destroyed when the cycle turned, erased so completely that only fragments would survive, sealed in stone or buried under oceans, or compressed into the very coal seams where impossible artifacts keep appearing. The ice does not lie. The pattern does not care what you believe. And the next black line, the next moment of reset, is not waiting in some distant future. It is overdue. Our textbooks present human progress as a straight line, beginning around 12,000 years ago, with the first permanent settlements in Mesopotamia, the first cultivation of wheat and barley, the first domestication of animals, the first organized societies that built temples and kept records and developed the earliest forms of writing. Before that moment, the story goes, humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, following game animals across landscapes, leaving no permanent mark, building nothing that would survive the seasons. This narrative is taught with confidence in every school, repeated in every documentary, accepted as settled fact by institutions that pride themselves on rigorous methodology and peer review. The timeline is clear, the evidence seems solid, and anyone who questions it is dismissed as fringe, or uneducated, or willfully ignorant of established science. But the Earth itself is older than all written memory, older than any human institution, older than the species we call Homo sapiens. And it keeps a different kind of record, one that does not care about academic consensus or institutional comfort. Ice cores drilled from Antarctica and Greenland contain chemical signatures stretching back 800,000 years. Ocean sediments pulled from the deep sea floor hold microscopic fossils and mineral deposits that record 2 million years of climate history. Fossilized pollen extracted from ancient bogs reveals which plants grew where and when, painting pictures of landscapes that shifted from lush forest to barren tundra and back again, over spans measured in millennia. Glacial scarring on bedrock shows where ice sheets miles thick ground across continents, carving valleys and pushing boulders hundreds of miles from their origin. Ancient shorelines visible in satellite imagery mark moments when sea levels stood 400 feet lower than today, exposing land bridges between continents and creating coastlines that are now drowned under oceans. Extinct river systems, traced through ground-penetrating radar, reveal drainage patterns that fed lakes and wetlands in places that are now desert, regions that once supported vast populations but are now lifeless sand. All of this data, collected by thousands of researchers over decades using methods that are robust and reproducible, tells a story that contradicts the simple narrative of steady progress. The story the Earth tells is one of cycles, of long periods of stability interrupted by moments of catastrophic change so severe they reshape continents and rewrite the conditions for life. Geologists call these transitions climate shifts, and they acknowledge that such shifts have occurred regularly throughout Earth's history. Biologists map population bottlenecks, moments when species nearly went extinct before recovering, and they note that these bottlenecks appear with rhythmic consistency. Archaeologists quietly acknowledge strange gaps in the progression of human tool-making, moments when sophisticated techniques appear suddenly with no evidence of gradual development, as if the knowledge came from somewhere already formed, rather than being invented through trial and error. One era shows humans using simple stone tools. The next era, separated by a gap that might represent thousands of years of lost time, shows humans constructing megalithic structures that require advanced mathematics, detailed astronomical knowledge, and engineering capabilities that should not exist according to the accepted timeline. These gaps are explained away as incomplete fossil records, as lucky discoveries waiting to be made, as evidence destroyed by time and weather and geological activity. And sometimes those explanations are correct. The fossil record is incomplete. Evidence does get destroyed. But when the gaps appear at exactly the moments marked by catastrophic transitions in ice cores and sediment layers, when the technological leaps coincide with the end of stable climate periods, when sophisticated structures appear immediately after global upheavals that should have set humanity back to survival mode, the explanations begin to feel less like honest assessment and more like protecting a narrative that cannot accommodate what the evidence actually suggests. The evidence from ice cores is particularly difficult to dismiss because ice preserves everything with stunning fidelity. When a volcano erupts, the ash particles spread through the atmosphere and eventually fall as part of the snow that accumulates on polar ice sheets. When a meteor strikes the Earth, the dust thrown into the stratosphere circles the globe and settles into that year's snowfall. When massive wildfires burn across continents, the soot rises into the upper atmosphere and becomes part of the permanent record. Every chemical change in the air, every shift in temperature, every fluctuation in cosmic radiation, all of it gets locked into ice that accumulates year after year, layer after layer, building a timeline that needs no interpretation, only measurement. And what that timeline reveals is deeply unsettling for anyone who believes human civilization is unique or unprecedented. The cycles appear with mathematical regularity. Every 90 to 100,000 years, the ice cores show evidence of massive disruption. Volcanic ash from multiple eruptions happening simultaneously across the planet. Temperature drops so steep, they indicate the sun's warmth was blocked by atmospheric debris. Chemical signatures suggesting ocean circulation patterns collapsed. Dust levels indicating massive drought. And then, within a few centuries, a recovery period where temperatures stabilize, volcanic activity returns to normal levels, and conditions suitable for complex life reassert themselves. These are not gradual transitions. These are hard boundaries between one world and another, moments when everything changed faster than any society could adapt, faster than any oral tradition could preserve detailed knowledge, fast enough that survivors would be reduced to scattered bands carrying only fragments of what their ancestors knew, forced to start over with whatever scraps of memory they could hold on to. Biologists studying human DNA have identified matching patterns. Population bottlenecks appear in the genetic record at moments that correspond precisely with the catastrophic transitions visible in ice cores. These bottlenecks indicate moments when human populations crashed to dangerously low numbers, when the total breeding population of our species may have fallen below 10,000 individuals worldwide. Moments when we came close to extinction before slowly recovering over thousands of years. The most recent major bottleneck appears around 70,000 years ago, matching a massive volcanic eruption at Toba in Indonesia that ejected so much ash into the atmosphere that global temperatures dropped by 15 degrees and stayed suppressed for years. The genetic diversity of every human alive today traces back through that bottleneck, meaning we are all descendants of the small population that survived when most of humanity perished. But here is what makes the pattern even more compelling. The archaeological record shows something strange happening after each recovery period. Sophisticated tools and techniques appear suddenly, fully formed, as if the knowledge came from inherited memory rather than gradual invention. After the Toba bottleneck, humans who had been using relatively simple stone tools for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly begin creating complex compound tools, sophisticated weapons, elaborate decorative objects, and showing signs of abstract symbolic thinking. The leap is too sudden, the progression is too fast. It feels less like innovation and more like rediscovery, as if the survivors of Toba carried knowledge from before the catastrophe, knowledge that took generations to fully reconstruct, but whose foundations were never completely lost. And if this pattern holds for the most recent bottleneck, the one we can study most clearly, then it likely holds for earlier bottlenecks as well, earlier catastrophes that nearly erased humanity and forced each generation of survivors to rebuild civilization from fragments. Some researchers propose that human advancement has always been cyclical, that we rise during stable periods, develop technologies and social structures suited to those conditions, and then collapse when the planet shifts into a new phase. Others suggest the pattern is natural, that no conspiracy or suppression is needed to explain why earlier civilizations left so little trace, because catastrophic resets destroy nearly everything, and time erases the rest. But a third possibility exists, one that is harder to confront and impossible to prove, but consistent with all the available evidence. What if earlier human civilizations, the ones that rose during previous stable periods, reached levels of complexity equal to or exceeding our own? What if they built cities, developed technologies, created works of art and engineering that rivaled anything we consider modern? And what if each of them was erased when the cycle turned, leaving behind only the hardiest traces, objects sealed in coal, structures too massive to erase completely, genetic memories encoded in the DNA of survivors, and stories passed down through so many generations they transformed into myths that we no longer recognize as history? In the 1990s, a team of glaciologists working in Greenland completed a deep ice core that revealed something unexpected. The transition from the last ice age to the current warm period did not happen gradually over thousands of years as models predicted. It happened in less than a decade. Temperature proxies in the ice showed that average global temperatures rose by 15 degrees in a span shorter than a single human lifetime. For people living through that transition, the change would have been catastrophic. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly began flooding as glaciers collapsed and meltwater poured into the oceans. River systems changed course as ice dams burst. Climate zones shifted hundreds of miles in a generation. Any civilization that existed during the stable period before the transition would have been destroyed, not by slow decline, but by sudden, overwhelming change that gave no time for adaptation. The researchers who made this discovery published their findings in respected journals. The data was clear, reproducible, and deeply troubling. If climate could shift that rapidly once, it could shift that rapidly again. The findings challenged the assumption that our current warm period, the Holocene, represents a new stable normal that will persist indefinitely. Instead, it suggested that we are living in a temporary stable phase between catastrophic transitions, and that the stability we take for granted could end with the same speed it began 12,000 years ago. The implications were profound, but the response from the broader scientific community was muted. Some researchers acknowledged the findings but downplayed their significance. Others suggested the rapid transition was a regional anomaly rather than a global event. Still others simply ignored the data, continuing to teach and publish as if the gradual change model remained valid. It was not a coordinated suppression. It was something more subtle. It was the inertia of established thinking, the difficulty of accepting that the ground beneath our feet is far less stable than we want to believe. Other researchers encountered similar resistance when their findings challenged comfortable assumptions. A geologist studying sediment cores from the Black Sea found evidence of massive flooding around 7,000 years ago, an event that matched legends from the region describing a catastrophic deluge that forced populations to flee to higher ground. The flooding was not mythical. It was real, measurable, the result of rising sea levels breaching a natural dam and pouring Mediterranean water into a lower basin with such force that the event would have been visible and traumatic to anyone living nearby. The researcher proposed that this flood might be the historical basis for stories that became the Noah narrative and similar flood myths from the region. The paper was published, received some attention, and then faded from discussion as mainstream archaeology continued to treat flood myths as purely symbolic rather than rooted in actual events. It was easier to maintain the separation between myth and history than to acknowledge that ancient stories might preserve real memories of real catastrophes. The pattern repeats across disciplines. Climate scientists find evidence of rapid change and are told not to alarm the public. Archaeologists discover sites that predate accepted timelines and are advised to recheck their dating methods. Geneticists identify population bottlenecks that suggest near-extinction events and are encouraged to frame their findings in ways that do not challenge the narrative of steady human progress. None of this is conspiracy. It is the cumulative effect of thousands of individual choices made by researchers who understand that challenging established narratives is professionally risky, emotionally exhausting, and often futile. So the evidence accumulates in journals that few people read, in data sets that sit unused, in conversations that happen quietly between researchers who know something is wrong, but lack the institutional support to force a reckoning. And the official story remains unchanged, a straight line from primitive beginnings to modern civilization, with no acknowledgement of the cycles visible in ice, in stone, in DNA, in the Earth's patient record of its own violent rhythms. The idea of repeating civilizations is not comfortable because it removes the specialness we assign to our own moment in history. We like to believe that we are the pinnacle of human achievement, that the technologies surrounding us represent unprecedented progress, that the networks connecting us and the knowledge we have accumulated make us fundamentally different from everyone who came before. But the ice cores and sediment layers and genetic bottlenecks suggest otherwise. They suggest that the conditions we consider normal, the stable climate and abundant resources and relative geological calm, are not permanent features of Earth, but temporary windows between catastrophic transitions. And during previous windows, previous stable periods that lasted thousands of years, humans did what humans always do. They built, they organized, they developed technologies suited to their environment. They created cultures rich with meaning and complexity. And then the window closed, the cycle turned, and everything they built was erased by forces that do not care about human achievement. If this interpretation is correct, then our modern world is not standing at the peak of a long climb. We are standing in the middle of a cycle, enjoying a temporary stability that will not last, blind to the signs that the next transition is approaching, because we have convinced ourselves that catastrophic change is something that happened to primitive people in ancient times, but could never happen to us with our science and our infrastructure and our ability to predict and control. But prediction requires recognizing patterns, and we refuse to recognize the pattern written in ice and stone because acknowledging it would mean admitting that we are not special, that our achievements are not unprecedented, and that the same forces that erased 6 or more civilizations before ours are still active, still cycling, still waiting for the moment when the stable period ends and the reset begins again. The deeper truth is even more unsettling. If earlier civilizations rose to complexity during previous stable periods, if they developed technologies we would recognize as advanced, if they built cities and accumulated knowledge and believed themselves permanent, then their failure to survive the transition tells us something important about our own chances. They were not stupid. They were not primitive. They were humans like us, with brains identical to ours, with the same capacity for innovation and planning and abstract thought. Whatever they knew, whatever they built, it was not enough to save them when the cycle turned. Which raises the question we do not want to ask. What makes us think we will be different? What makes us believe that our satellites and computers and global networks will protect us from forces that operate on geological timescales and do not care about human cleverness? The ice cores do not offer reassurance. They offer warning. They show us that stability is temporary, that the ground beneath our feet has shifted before and will shift again, and that the next black line in the ice, the next moment of catastrophic transition, is not waiting in some distant future. It is overdue. Perhaps the most important thing the cyclical timeline reveals is not the inevitability of collapse, but the persistence of recovery. After every catastrophic transition visible in the ice, life returns. Temperatures stabilize, ecosystems rebuild, and humans, reduced to small populations carrying fragments of knowledge, begin the long process of reconstruction. This pattern repeats across every bottleneck, every reset, every moment when the world ended and then slowly began again. Which means that even if the next transition destroys our current civilization, even if our cities are buried and our technologies are lost and our accumulated knowledge scatters like ash, humans will likely survive in small numbers, carrying whatever they can preserve, and eventually they will rebuild. The question is not whether humanity continues. The question is whether we learn from the pattern, whether we prepare for what the Earth's own records tell us is coming, whether we find ways to preserve knowledge across the transition so that those who come after do not have to start from nothing, or whether we, like every civilization before us, refuse to see the cycle until it is too late, convinced that our moment is different, that our achievements exempt us from the rhythms written in ice and stone, and the patient memory of a planet that has seen all of this before. Do you feel it now? The rhythm beneath history? The pattern that repeats across spans of time so vast they make recorded civilization feel like a single breath. The ice does not lie. The sediment layers do not lie. The genetic bottlenecks do not lie. They all point to the same conclusion. The Earth operates on cycles of stability and catastrophic change, and we are living in one of the stable periods, blind to the fact that such periods always end, always have ended, always will end as long as this planet continues its dance through space and time. If this evidence is shifting your understanding, if you are beginning to see the cracks in the official timeline, then let others know by leaving a like on this video, so the algorithm understands that people are ready for these conversations, that the old comfortable narratives are no longer sufficient, and that truth, however unsettling, is what we need most in this moment. Your engagement is not just a number. It is a signal that helps content like this reach the people who are searching for deeper answers. Because what comes next takes us from the rhythm of collapse into the memory of catastrophe. We have seen the pattern in ice and stone. Now we need to understand how that pattern survived in human consciousness, how the memory of these catastrophic transitions was preserved across thousands of years in the only form that could survive when everything else was destroyed. Stories, myths, flood legends that appear in every culture on every continent, describing the same events with such consistency that dismissing them as coincidence becomes harder than accepting them as history. The next chapter takes us into the global flood myths, the trauma memories carried forward by survivors who witnessed the world ending and needed to warn everyone who came after. The ice showed us the timing. The myths will show us what it felt like, to live through the moment when stability collapsed and the cycle turned. Stay with me as we listen to the voices that refused to be silenced, the stories that persisted across millennia because the truth they carried was too important to forget, the warnings encoded in legend because legend was the only library that survived the flames. The evidence continues to build, and the pattern becomes clearer with each layer we uncover. The next mystery awaits. Chapter 3. The Global Flood Myths, Trauma Written in Memory. You are sitting by a fire in the highlands of Peru, 13,000 feet above sea level, where the air is so thin that every breath feels incomplete, and the cold reaches through your clothes no matter how close you sit to the flames. An elder sits across from you, his face carved by decades of sun and wind, his hands moving slowly as he speaks in Quechua, the language that survived the Spanish conquest and reaches back through time to civilizations that built cities in the clouds. He is telling you a story his grandfather told him, a chain of telling that extends so far back that no one remembers when it began. The story describes a season of darkness so complete that people could not see their own hands. A darkness that lasted not for a night or a week, but for years, while the sky turned the color of ash and the sun became a pale disk that gave no warmth. During this time, the waters rose from below and fell from above simultaneously, drowning the world, forcing the few survivors to flee to the highest peaks, carrying whatever they could save. You listen, watching the firelight flicker across the elder's face, and you think about the other stories you have heard. 2 weeks ago, you sat in the Australian outback with an Aboriginal elder who described burning rain that fell from the sky when the earth shook and mountains exploded, turning day into night and forcing ancestors to walk inland from coastlines that no longer exist. 3 months before that, you studied Sumerian tablets reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, with its detailed description of a flood so massive it erased cities and forced Utnapishtim to build a great boat. The biblical account of Noah, the Hindu story of Manu, the Greek tale of Deucalion, the Chinese legend of Gunyu, indigenous American stories from dozens of tribes describing waters that covered the earth and forced humanity to start again from almost nothing. These stories should not be identical. They come from cultures separated by oceans, by mountain ranges, by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Cultures that had no contact with each other. Yet the details align with precision that should be impossible. Water rising suddenly and without mercy. Darkness lasting years. The sun obscured. Survivors fleeing to high ground. A chosen few tasked with preserving knowledge. Animals saved. Seeds protected. The memory of what was lost. And most striking of all, the timing. Nearly every flood tradition points to the same narrow window, roughly 12,000 years ago, the moment when the last ice age ended and sea levels rose 400 feet in a span of centuries, drowning coastlines where millions likely lived, erasing entire landscapes, transforming the world so completely that survivors could only describe it as the end of everything. You look at the elder across the fire, and you realize that what he is telling you is not mythology. It is memory. Trauma memory carried forward through generations, compressed and shaped and wrapped in symbolic language to help it survive the journey across time. But at its core, preserving something real, something that happened, something so catastrophic that forgetting it would have meant losing the most important lesson humans ever learned. The world can end. It has ended before. And the only reason anyone survived was because someone remembered the warning signs and prepared for what seemed impossible until it arrived. For centuries, scholars treated flood myths as exactly that, myths. Stories invented by primitive cultures attempting to explain natural disasters like seasonal flooding, or to provide moral frameworks for behavior. The biblical flood was understood as allegory, a teaching about sin and redemption. The Greek flood of Deucalion was seen as poetic license. Sumerian flood stories were acknowledged as older than the biblical account, suggesting these narratives evolved and spread through cultural contact. The dominant academic position held that flood myths represented universal human concerns about water and destruction, projected backward onto imagined cataclysms that never actually occurred on the scale described. This interpretation made sense within a framework that assumed human civilization was young, that recorded history represented the totality of human experience, and that anything predating written records was unknowable, except through archaeological fragments. If humans had only been building cities for 5,000 or 6,000 years, then stories describing global catastrophes 12,000 years ago could not be historical. They had to be invented, symbolic, mythological in the truest sense of representing ideas rather than events. The fact that flood stories appeared across unconnected cultures was explained through psychological universalism, the idea that all humans face similar environmental challenges and therefore develop similar narrative structures. Flooding happens everywhere. Rivers overflow. Storms bring devastating rain. So naturally, every culture would develop stories about great floods, and the similarities reflected shared human psychology rather than shared human history. But this comfortable explanation began to fracture as multiple lines of scientific evidence converged on a different picture. Geological surveys revealed ancient shorelines far below current sea levels, showing that vast areas of continental shelf, now underwater, were once dry land. These submerged landscapes contained features that looked like river valleys, lake beds, and coastal plains, exactly the terrain that would have supported large human populations during the Ice Age. Marine archaeologists, using sonar, discovered structures on these drowned shelves, stone formations too regular to be natural. Climate scientists analyzing ice cores and ocean sediments confirmed that the transition from Ice Age to the current warm period happened with shocking speed, that massive amounts of meltwater poured into the oceans over just a few centuries, raising sea levels at rates that would have been catastrophic for anyone living along coastlines. Suddenly, the flood myths looked less like primitive imagination and more like historical memory. If millions of people lived on coastal plains that were drowned when ice sheets collapsed, if their cities and farms were swallowed by rising water within the span of a few human lifetimes, then survivors would absolutely tell stories about it. They would describe the water rising, the land disappearing, the desperate flight to higher ground. And those stories would be passed down with the urgency that comes from knowing that forgetting this event would mean losing the most important warning their ancestors could give. The flood was not mythological. It was historical. The evidence supporting the historical interpretation of flood myths is not circumstantial. It is written in layers of sediment, in the chemical composition of ancient ice, in the genetic signatures of human populations that show massive bottlenecks around 12,000 years ago, and in ruins of drowned cities that rest exactly where the flood stories said they would be. When researchers began taking the myths seriously enough to search for physical evidence, they found it. In the Black Sea, marine geologists discovered a layer of sediment marking the moment, around 7,500 years ago, when sea level rose suddenly, breaching a natural dam and allowing Mediterranean water to pour into what had been a lower freshwater lake. The flooding would have been sudden, visible, traumatic for anyone living around the lake's shores. The sediment layer matches the timing of flood stories from Mesopotamia, stories that describe a deluge sent by the gods, stories that may preserve memory of real people watching the water rise. In the Persian Gulf, underwater surveys revealed ancient river valleys and settlement sites now submerged under hundreds of feet of water, landscapes that would have been prime real estate before sea levels rose. These drowned areas correspond precisely with Sumerian texts describing a time before the flood, when cities existed in lowlands now beneath the sea. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf that once connected Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand shows evidence of river systems and coastal settlements flooded when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Indigenous stories describe lands that vanished beneath the ocean, journeys ancestors made across ground that is now deep water. These are not vague accounts. They include geographical details, descriptions of landmarks, references to specific locations that match the drowned topography visible in sonar scans. The Aboriginal Australians have maintained oral traditions that describe coastlines extending far beyond the current shore, specific locations where fresh water could be found on what is now the continental shelf, routes traveled by ancestors between places now separated by ocean. When these oral maps were compared with bathymetric data showing the shape of the seafloor, they matched. The stories were accurate. They preserved geographical knowledge from a time when sea levels were lower, which means they have been maintained for at least 10,000 years, passed from generation to generation with such fidelity that they still describe a world that no longer exists above water. This is not mythology. This is cartography, preserved in the only medium that could survive when everything else was lost. The consistency of detail across these flood traditions is what makes them impossible to dismiss as coincidence. They describe not just water, but specific conditions that match what would have occurred during meltwater pulses at the end of the Ice Age. darkness lasting years, corresponding with volcanic eruptions that often accompany rapid climate transitions. Cold following the flood, matching the Younger Dryas period when temperatures dropped suddenly. Changes in the sun and stars, visible as atmospheric conditions shifted. Survivors fleeing to mountains, exactly what people on drowned coastal plains would have done. Instructions to preserve seeds, animals, knowledge, what any culture facing catastrophic change would prioritize. These are not generic flood stories. These are survival manuals encoded in narrative form, instructions from ancestors about what to watch for, what to save, how to prepare when the signs appear again. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient Sumerian city of Ur and discovered something extraordinary. Below the ruins, below layers of pottery and building foundations, he found a layer of clean, water-laid silt, 8 feet thick, with no artifacts, no signs of human habitation, just pure sediment deposited by water. Below that sterile layer, he found more artifacts, older settlements, evidence of human occupation predating the flood layer. Woolley believed he had found physical evidence of the biblical flood. His discovery made headlines. The flood was real, newspapers proclaimed. But mainstream academia pushed back. The silt layer was local, they said, evidence of a river flood, not a global catastrophe. The fact that similar layers appeared at other Mesopotamian sites was dismissed as regional climate patterns, not evidence of massive flooding. Decades later, marine geologist Robert Ballard, famous for discovering the Titanic, turned his attention to the Black Sea flood hypothesis. Using underwater robots and sonar mapping, his team found ancient shorelines, preserved buildings, and clear evidence that the Black Sea had once been much smaller before catastrophic flooding raised its level suddenly. Ballard identified artifacts and structures matching the timing of flood stories from the region. He proposed that this event became the basis for flood myths that spread throughout the ancient Near East. His findings were published in respected journals and received significant media coverage. But the response from mainstream archaeology was muted. Interesting, they said, but regional, not evidence of the global flood described in myths from around the world. In Australia, anthropologists working with Aboriginal elders documented stories describing specific geographical features now underwater, coastlines that existed when sea levels were lower. When these oral traditions were tested against geological data, they proved accurate, preserving information about landscapes drowned 10,000 years ago. The research was published and discussed in specialized journals, but it never penetrated mainstream consciousness, never forced a reconsideration of how long oral traditions can reliably preserve historical information. The pattern of dismissal is consistent across cultures and across decades. When indigenous groups insist their stories are history, they are told they are confusing myth with reality. When geological evidence matches the timing and description of flood myths, it is explained as coincidence or regional phenomena. When underwater ruins appear exactly where the stories said lost cities would be, they are classified as natural formations until proven otherwise. The result is a strange disconnect, where the evidence for historical floods is overwhelming. The stories are consistent across cultures. The physical and geological data align with narrative accounts, but the official position remains that these are myths, not memories, allegories, not history. The flood myths do not simply mourn destruction. They hint at what existed before the catastrophe. Some describe an age of brightness when knowledge was abundant. Others speak of machines that hummed like living things, of cities that glowed at night without fire, of technologies that allowed communication across vast distances. These details are usually dismissed as embellishment, fantasy layered onto historical events. But what if they are not fantasy? What if earlier civilizations reached levels of technological sophistication that survivors could only describe in terms that made sense to them, terms that we now read as mythological because we assume nothing advanced could have existed before recorded history. The stories consistently describe survivors as carrying forward fragments of knowledge. In Sumerian accounts, gods who survived the flood teach humans how to rebuild civilization. In Egyptian traditions, divine beings arrive after catastrophe and establish order, bringing knowledge of astronomy, architecture, and governance. In Mesoamerican myths, culture heroes appear following destruction and instruct people in agriculture and construction. These narratives follow the same pattern. Catastrophe erases most of what existed. A few survivors carry forward pieces of knowledge. That knowledge becomes the seed from which the next civilization grows, explaining why sophisticated techniques and astronomical understanding appear suddenly in the archaeological record without clear precursors. It is not that these things were invented from nothing, it is that they were remembered, recovered, reconstructed from fragments carried across the divide between worlds. The most important thing the flood myths preserve is not the memory of what was lost, but the warning about what will happen again. Nearly every flood tradition includes a prediction, a promise that the waters will return, that the darkness will come again, that the cycle repeats. This is not pessimism. This is pattern recognition, encoded in the most durable medium humans possessed, oral tradition passed with ritual significance, story structure designed to be memorable and to resist corruption across countless retellings. The ancestors who survived the flood understood something we have forgotten. They understood that the world is not stable, that catastrophic change is not a historical anomaly, but a recurring feature of living on this planet, and that survival depends on recognizing the pattern and preparing before the next cycle begins. Can you hear them now? The voices reaching across 10,000 years, speaking through stories we were taught to dismiss as primitive fantasy. The flood myths are not mythology. They are memory. They are warning. They are the testimony of survivors who watched the world drown and needed to tell everyone who came after what they witnessed and what they learned. If this evidence is changing how you understand ancient stories, if you are beginning to see that our ancestors were trying to tell us something true and important, then help this investigation reach others who are ready to listen. Leave a like. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the old stories are not fantasies, but histories preserved in the only form that could survive when everything else was swept away. Because what comes next takes us from the stories preserved in memory to the physical evidence preserved in stone and water. We have heard the voices of the survivors describing what they witnessed. Now we descend beneath the oceans to see what they left behind, the drowned cities that rest exactly where the flood myths said they would be. The structures arranged in geometric precision on continental shelves that were dry land when our ancestors built upon them. The myths told us the flood was real. The ice cores showed us when it happened. Now the underwater ruins will show us what was lost, what the rising waters buried, what civilizations existed before the world drowned. The evidence continues to build. The pattern becomes undeniable. Stay with me as we descend into the drowned kingdoms and see with our own eyes what the myths described. The next mystery awaits. Chapter 4. The Sunken Kingdoms. Cities beneath the waves. You are descending through dark water off the coast of Japan, your dive light cutting through the murk like a knife through smoke, illuminating particles of sediment that drift in the current like snow falling upward. The pressure increases with every meter, pressing against your wetsuit, reminding you that you are entering a realm where humans do not belong. Your breathing sounds loud in your ears, the steady rhythm of inhale and exhale through the regulator, the only sound in this liquid silence. The depth gauge on your wrist reads 30 meters, then 40, then 50, and still the bottom has not appeared. Your dive partner signals that you are approaching the structure, the anomaly that brought you here, the formation that appears on sonar scans as something that should not exist at this depth. And then, through the gloom, you see it. A massive stone terrace rising from the seafloor, its edge too straight to be natural, its surface too flat to be the product of erosion or geological accident. You approach slowly, your light revealing details that make your pulse quicken. The terrace is not alone. It connects to other terraces, each one stepped precisely below the previous one, creating what looks like a massive staircase descending into deeper darkness. You run your gloved hand along the surface, feeling the smoothness of the stone, and you find grooves, parallel lines carved with deliberate spacing, channels that might have carried water or served some purpose you cannot determine, but that speak of intention, planning, engineering. Nature does not carve parallel grooves. Nature does not create stepped terraces with measured intervals between each level. Nature does not produce right angles or flat plazas that extend for dozens of meters in perfect geometric arrangement. You follow the structure deeper, your light revealing more impossible features. What appears to be a carved retaining wall, massive blocks fitted together with precision that would be impressive on dry land, and is inexplicable here under 50 meters of ocean. A formation that resembles a pyramid, its sides too symmetrical to be accidental, its orientation aligned to cardinal directions. Wide boulevards, flat pathways connecting different sections, paths that seem designed for movement between areas that might have served different functions. And everywhere, the sense that you are not looking at geology, but at archaeology. Not at a natural formation, but at ruins. At something that was built above water when this coastline extended far beyond its current position. Something that was constructed when sea levels stood lower during the last ice age. Something that was drowned when the ice sheets melted and the oceans rose 400 feet and swallowed the coastal plains where civilizations might have thrived. You check your dive computer. You have been down for 30 minutes, and you need to begin ascending soon. But you do not want to leave. You want to map every detail, document every angle, understand how this structure was made, and by whom, and when. But time and pressure and the limits of human physiology force you upward. You ascend slowly, watching the structure disappear back into the darkness below, and you surface with more questions than answers. Because what you saw down there challenges everything you were taught about the timeline of human civilization. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges that underwater formations exist at sites like Yonaguni, but the official position treats them as geological oddities, natural sandstone formations shaped by tectonic activity and ocean currents into patterns that coincidentally resemble human construction. The parallel grooves are explained as erosion channels. The stepped terraces are described as natural fracturing in sedimentary rock. The right angles and flat surfaces are attributed to the way certain types of stone break under geological stress. When pressed about the improbability of so many architectural features appearing together by chance, the response is that probability means nothing when dealing with millions of years of geological time, that given enough time, any pattern can emerge from chaos. This explanation extends to other underwater sites around the world. Off the coast of India, near Gujarat, sonar scans revealed what appeared to be a grid of walls and foundations 5 kilometers wide, structures that matched descriptions in ancient Sanskrit texts of Dwarka, a port city said to have been swallowed by the sea in a single night. When divers investigated and found carved stone columns lying toppled across the seabed, the official response was caution, skepticism, a call for more evidence before making claims that would challenge accepted chronologies. In the waters between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, sonar sweeps of the Sunda Shelf revealed straight channels and rectangular depressions too perfect to be natural, features that might represent harbors and causeways from when this entire region was dry land. The response was similar, interesting, potentially significant, but insufficient to overturn the established timeline. Off the coast of Cuba, deep-sea scanners detected massive stone blocks arranged in patterns resembling city streets. Near the Bahamas, the Bimini Road continues to generate debate. Its massive stones, too uniform and too deliberately placed for erosion alone to explain, yet dismissed by most archaeologists as natural, despite evidence of tool marks. Along continental shelves around the globe, fishermen occasionally pull up carved stone fragments in their nets, lonely remnants of structures long since drowned. Artifacts that get photographed, sometimes make local news, and then disappear into storage without systematic study. The pattern is consistent. When underwater structures are discovered, initial excitement gives way to official skepticism. The burden of proof is set impossibly high. Natural explanations are preferred even when those explanations require believing that geological processes coincidentally created formations that look exactly like human architecture. Funding for underwater archaeological research in these areas becomes difficult to secure. Permits to dive and document sites are delayed or denied. Sonar data collected by government agencies is classified or restricted, and the few independent researchers who persist find their work marginalized, published in alternative journals, discussed in documentaries that are dismissed as fringe entertainment. The problem with dismissing these underwater structures as natural formations is that natural formations do not behave the way these structures behave. When geologists analyze the Yonaguni site in detail, they find features that are extremely difficult to explain through geology alone. The stepped terraces maintain consistent riser heights across the entire structure, each step approximately 2 meters tall, a regularity that would require fracturing patterns to repeat with precision across different areas. The flat plazas show no accumulated sediment of the type that should exist if these surfaces formed millions of years ago. The grooves and channels run parallel for dozens of meters, maintaining their spacing and depth, something erosion does not do because water flow is chaotic. At Dwarka, the evidence becomes even harder to dismiss. Marine archaeologists working under India's National Institute of Oceanography recovered artifacts that were unambiguously human-made. Pottery fragments, stone anchors, carved pillars with decorative elements that match architectural styles described in ancient texts. Carbon dating on organic material found at the site returned ages around 9,000 years, placing the structures firmly in the period after the Ice Age ended, but before the conventional beginning of Indian civilization. The geometry of the underwater city matches descriptions in the Mahabharata, texts written thousands of years ago, describing a prosperous port that was consumed by the ocean. The alignment of structures suggests urban planning, a grid layout indicating organized society. Yet mainstream archaeology treats Dwarka as an anomaly, an interesting site that requires more study, but not evidence sufficient to rewrite the timeline. The Sunda Shelf presents perhaps the most compelling case because of its scale. During the last ice age, when sea levels were 400 feet lower, this region formed a landmass larger than India, connecting what are now islands into a vast continent with river systems, inland seas, and coastlines extending hundreds of miles beyond their current positions. Geologists estimate that this Sundaland could have supported tens of millions of people if populations developed there during the long, stable period before the ice melted. When sonar scans reveal features that resemble harbors, when bathymetric mapping shows river valleys and terrain perfectly suited for agriculture and settlement, the natural question is not whether people lived there, but how advanced their cultures became before the rising waters drowned everything they built. The flood myths from Southeast Asian cultures specifically describe lands that vanished beneath the ocean, journeys that ancestors made across ground that is now deep water. These stories are treated as mythology, but the drowned topography matches the stories with precision. Some researchers propose that the structures are natural formations that were modified and used by ancient peoples, a compromise position that acknowledges human involvement without requiring belief in lost civilizations. Others suggest the sites represent early experiments in coastal engineering. These explanations fail to account for the scale and sophistication of the structures, the fact that they appear in multiple locations separated by thousands of miles, and the way they align with flood myths that describe not simple coastal villages, but actual cities with complex architecture. A third explanation exists, one that is harder to accept, but more consistent with all available evidence. During the long, stable period of the last ice age, human civilizations developed on what are now continental shelves. These civilizations built cities, created harbor installations, developed maritime cultures. When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose catastrophically, these coastal civilizations were destroyed, their cities drowned, their populations forced inland, their achievements lost beneath hundreds of feet of water. In 1985, a dive instructor named Kihachiro Aratake was searching for hammerhead sharks off the coast of Yonaguni Island when he discovered the massive underwater terraces by accident. He documented what he found with photographs and video, brought other divers to witness the structure, and contacted marine geologists to investigate what appeared to be a submerged pyramid. Professor Masaki Kimura from the University of the Ryukyus spent years studying the site, leading dozens of dives, mapping the structure in detail, analyzing the stone composition and the features that suggested human modification. Kimura concluded that the structure was at least partially man-made, that it showed clear signs of carving and shaping, that it dated to the end of the last ice age, when the area would have been above water, and that it represented evidence of a sophisticated culture existing in Japan far earlier than the conventional timeline acknowledged. The response from mainstream archaeology was swift and dismissive. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, dove the site and concluded it was entirely natural, formed by tectonic activity and erosion, and that the appearance of architecture was coincidental. His assessment was widely quoted in academic circles and media coverage, effectively ending serious consideration of Yonaguni as archaeological evidence, despite the fact that Schoch spent only a few hours at the site, while Kimura had conducted years of detailed study. The debate polarized. Those who accepted Yonaguni as man-made were labeled fringe theorists. Those who dismissed it as natural were praised for scientific rigor. No middle ground existed, and gradually, as media attention faded, Yonaguni became a curiosity, a dive site for tourists, but not a serious topic for academic research or funding. Similar patterns emerged at other underwater sites. S.R. Rao, the marine archaeologist who led the Dwarka excavations, faced skepticism and resistance when his findings suggested the site was thousands of years older than conventional Indian history allowed. His work was published, received some attention in India, but was largely ignored by international archaeology. Graham Hancock, a journalist who documented multiple underwater structures, was dismissed as a pseudoscientist, despite presenting extensive photographic evidence. The common thread was that anyone who took these underwater structures seriously, anyone who suggested they might represent pre-flood civilizations, was marginalized. Their work categorized as alternative history rather than legitimate research. Meanwhile, access to the sites became increasingly restricted. The Japanese government designated Yonaguni a protected zone with limitations on diving and documentation. The Indian government controlled access to Dwarka through a permit system. The Indonesian government showed little interest in funding systematic exploration of the Sunda Shelf. The drowned kingdoms do not merely hint at lost civilizations, they challenge the foundation of the timeline itself. If cities existed on coastal plains before those plains were drowned, if sophisticated cultures developed maritime technologies and built harbors during the Ice Age when coastlines extended far beyond their current positions, then human civilization is not 12,000 years old. It is far older, staggered across multiple rises and collapses, like footprints fading into deep water. The artifacts sealed in coal whispered this possibility,
The cycles in ice cores confirmed the timing of catastrophic change. The flood myths preserved the memory of what survivors witnessed. And now, the underwater ruins provide physical proof, structures that stand exactly where the stories said lost cities would be. What makes the drowned kingdoms particularly significant is not just their existence, but their implications for understanding collapse. A city can flood, but knowledge does not disappear so easily, unless something more powerful than rising water erases it. When you study the flood myths carefully, you notice that they do not simply describe water. They describe darkness, years when the sun was obscured, cold that followed warmth, volcanic eruptions, massive storms, conditions suggesting that the end of the Ice Age was not a gentle transition, but a catastrophic series of events happening simultaneously. Volcanic winters from super eruptions, floods from glacial lakes bursting their ice dams,
Earthquakes from the redistribution of weight as ice sheets melted, tsunamis from undersea landslides. The drowned cities were not destroyed by rising water alone. They were destroyed by a convergence of catastrophes that would have overwhelmed any civilization, regardless of its technological sophistication. This realization is both humbling and terrifying. Humbling because it removes the assumption that we are somehow special, that our technologies make us immune to forces that destroyed earlier cultures. Terrifying because it suggests that advancement does not guarantee survival, that complex systems depend on stability, and stability is temporary. The underwater ruins are not just evidence of what was. They are warnings about what will be. They show us that the coastal cities we build, the centers of population that cluster along shorelines, are exactly where earlier civilizations built their centers, and exactly what was lost when sea levels rose. We live in the same places. We depend on the same stability. We face the same forces. Can you see them now? The drowned kingdoms sleeping under 400 feet of water, their streets silent, their plazas empty, their stories waiting for anyone brave enough to descend into the darkness and ask, what happened here? These underwater structures are not geological accidents. They are ruins. They are evidence. They are physical proof that civilizations existed before the accepted beginning of history, and that those civilizations were destroyed when the world changed in ways that no one anticipated and no technology could prevent. If this evidence is reshaping your understanding of human history, if you are beginning to see that the official timeline has enormous gaps where entire ages might be hidden, then help this investigation reach others who need to know what lies beneath the oceans. Leave a like. Share this chapter with someone who is ready to question the comfortable narratives we have been taught. Because what comes next takes us from the physical evidence of drowned cities into something even more intimate and undeniable. We have seen the structures beneath the waves. Now we examine the evidence written in your own body, in the genetic code that you carry, in DNA sequences that make no sense unless your ancestors survived catastrophes so severe they rewrote the human genome. The sunken kingdoms show us what was lost, but your genes show us who survived. And within those genetic markers lies proof that earlier cycles of collapse were real, that population bottlenecks nearly erased humanity, that the people who endured carried adaptations that only make sense if they faced conditions we cannot imagine. The investigation continues. The evidence grows stronger, and the next chapter reveals that you are not separate from this story. You are part of it. Stay with me as we decode the message written in your cells. The mystery deepens, and it leads directly to you. Chapter 5. The Survivor's Code. DNA Memory of Lost Worlds. You are sitting in a genetics laboratory looking at a screen displaying sequences of human DNA, rows of letters representing the 4 chemical bases that combine in endless patterns to encode everything that makes you human. Most of what you see follows predictable patterns, shaped by tens of thousands of years of adaptation to climate, diet, disease, and migration. The sequences tell stories that geneticists can read with increasing accuracy. Most genes behave exactly as evolutionary theory predicts. They change slowly through random mutation and natural selection. They reflect the environments that shaped them. But then your colleague points to a cluster of sequences on the screen, a combination of genetic markers that appears in less than half of 1% of the global population, and says the words that make you lean closer. This does not make sense. The markers are too rare to be random, appearing in such a small percentage of humanity that they should have been eliminated by genetic drift if they served no purpose. Yet they persist across generations with remarkable consistency. They are too unusual to fit neatly within known branches of human ancestry, showing up in populations separated by oceans and mountain ranges and thousands of years of independent development. And they are too sophisticated to be simple adaptations to local conditions, encoding traits that suggest preparation for circumstances that no longer exist in the modern world. You zoom in on the sequences, examining the specific genes involved. Enhanced resistance to hypoxia, the ability to function with reduced oxygen levels, but not in the gradual way that develops in high-altitude populations. This is different, more acute, as if it evolved to handle sudden atmospheric changes. Unusual endurance under physical strain, metabolic pathways that extract energy from limited resources with efficiency exceeding normal human physiology. And most striking, heightened activity in brain regions associated with spatial memory and environmental recognition, the ability to orient oneself in unfamiliar landscapes, to track seasonal changes with unusual accuracy, to read patterns in weather and sky as if those patterns were language. You check the distribution of this genetic cluster. Highland communities of India, isolated coastal tribes of Southeast Asia, indigenous Australians, the Basque people of Western Europe. These groups share no recent history, no common language, no clear migratory link. Yet the same markers appear in all of them, bundled together as if inherited from a shared ancestor whose lineage stretches back before the flood, and who left their genetic signature in the small groups that survived when the waters rose and most of humanity perished. Human DNA is a vast library containing the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of evolution. Most genetic variations make perfect sense. Darker skin near the equator protects against ultraviolet radiation. Lactose tolerance in dairy populations provides nutritional advantage. Altitude adaptation allows efficient oxygen use. Disease resistance reflects generations of selective pressure. These patterns are well understood, thoroughly documented, entirely consistent with evolutionary theory. But geneticists occasionally encounter variations that do not fit neatly into this story. Markers that appear where they should not, traits that seem over-engineered for their environments, clusters of genes suggesting preparation for circumstances that no current population faces. The standard approach is to search for explanations within existing frameworks. Perhaps the trait developed in response to historical conditions that no longer exist. Perhaps it represents genetic drift, random changes that persisted because they did no harm. Perhaps the trait comes from interbreeding with archaic hominins, like Neanderthals or Denisovans. These explanations often work, but the cluster of traits associated with catastrophe survival does not dissolve under scrutiny. It does not match Neanderthal or Denisovan markers. It does not correlate with altitude, latitude, or any obvious environmental variable. It appears in populations that should have no genetic connection, groups that diverged tens of thousands of years ago, yet they share these specific markers with precision, suggesting they inherited them from a common source. The traits themselves are puzzling because they seem designed for conditions that humans have not faced in recorded history. Adaptations useful during rapid climate change, during periods of reduced sunlight and atmospheric disruption, during scenarios where populations needed to move quickly across unfamiliar terrain while tracking celestial patterns, despite massive environmental shifts. These are not adaptations for stable conditions. These are adaptations for survival during catastrophic transitions. Brain imaging studies of individuals carrying the catastrophe survival cluster show consistent differences in neural architecture. The hippocampus displays enhanced connectivity to regions processing visual and astronomical information. The prefrontal cortex shows development in areas associated with long-term planning and pattern recognition across extended timescales. These are measurable structural differences correlating directly with specific genetic markers. When researchers test cognitive function in carriers versus non-carriers, the differences persist. Carriers perform better on tasks requiring navigation without modern tools, on tracking cyclical patterns, on maintaining orientation during simulated environmental disruption. They are specialized, tuned for survival-relevant cognition. The metabolic adaptations are equally striking. One gene influences cellular repair mechanisms, resembling adaptations found in deep-diving mammals, species that function with drastically reduced oxygen. Humans do not naturally face conditions requiring that metabolic flexibility, yet this variant exists in the survivor cluster, suggesting that at some point in our ancestry, some population faced circumstances where oxygen deprivation provided critical survival advantage. Another gene alters how mitochondria respond to reduced sunlight, allowing efficient energy extraction from limited resources, an adaptation useful during volcanic winters when solar radiation dropped and food production collapsed. The geographic distribution provides the strongest argument that these traits originated during catastrophic events. The Basque people have long puzzled geneticists. Their language has no known relatives, their genetic profile shows unusual markers, and they carry the catastrophe survival cluster at higher frequencies than almost any other European group. They are positioned near what would have been prime coastal territory during the Ice Age, land now underwater. In northern Australia, Aboriginal groups maintain oral traditions spanning more than 10,000 years, describing coastlines that existed when sea levels were lower. When these oral maps were compared with bathymetric data, they matched. These same groups carry the genetic cluster. In highlands of India and mountains of Southeast Asia, in regions that would have served as refuges when lowlands flooded, isolated communities preserve the markers alongside traditions describing ancestors who fled rising waters. The most unsettling observation is that the genetic cluster is not dormant. Epigenetic markers show increased activity on these catastrophe survival genes in recent generations. The genes are turning on, becoming more active, as if responding to environmental cues matching conditions under which they evolved. Rising carbon dioxide, shifting magnetic fields, changing climate patterns. The human genome is detecting signals that previous generations did not encounter, and it is responding by activating ancient adaptations, preparing the body for conditions that last occurred during catastrophic transitions visible in ice cores. This is not conscious. This is deeper than thought, operating at the cellular level, biology recognizing patterns that the conscious mind cannot see. In the early 2000s, Dr. Spencer Wells, leading the Genographic Project, collected samples from indigenous groups whose ancestors had lived in the same regions for thousands of years. Among the data, researchers noticed a cluster of markers that did not fit any known haplogroup. The markers appeared in unrelated populations, showed no correlation with geography or climate, and seemed to encode traits making no sense in modern environments. When findings were prepared for publication, peer reviewers raised questions. Where did these markers come from? What selective pressure could have produced them? The paper was revised, unusual markers relegated to supplementary data, and the published version focused on conventional migration patterns. The anomalies were noted, but not explored. Dr. Eska Villerslev, specializing in ancient DNA, encountered similar patterns studying genetic material from prehistoric remains. Skeletons from sites predating the flood period showed genetic diversity, including markers matching the catastrophe survival cluster. But skeletons from sites immediately after the flood period showed dramatically reduced diversity overall, with catastrophe markers appearing at much higher frequencies in surviving populations. The genetic data suggested a massive population bottleneck, a moment when human numbers crashed and only specific lineages carrying specific adaptations made it through. Villerslev noted these patterns in his publications, described the bottleneck, but the interpretation remained conventional. Climate change, resource scarcity, normal evolutionary pressures. The possibility that the bottleneck resulted from catastrophic events requiring specialized survival traits was not seriously considered. Indigenous groups themselves have long known that some families carry traits others do not. In Aboriginal Australian culture, certain lineages are recognized as having exceptional navigation abilities, instinctive understanding of land and sky beyond learned knowledge. These families are often the keepers of the oldest stories, the longest genealogies, the most accurate geographical traditions. When geneticists tested members of these lineages, they found the catastrophe survival cluster at frequencies far exceeding the general population. The families who carried the genes were the families who carried the stories, as if genetic memory and oral tradition were two ways of preserving the same information. The resistance to studying these patterns seriously is subtle. Genetic research requires funding, and funding agencies prefer projects with clear applications. Projects investigating genetic anomalies pointing toward catastrophic prehistory have no obvious application. So the research does not get funded. The patterns remain in databases, noted in supplementary materials, available to anyone who looks carefully, but never integrated into mainstream understanding. The discovery that human DNA carries markers specifically adapted for catastrophe survival proves that humans today are not starting from zero. We carry echoes of ancient worlds in our biology, in instructions written into our cells, in adaptations that serve no purpose in stable environments, but would become critical if conditions shifted toward chaos visible in ice cores and flood myths. The genetic code is not just a record of where we came from, it is preparation for where we might be going, a biological warning system tuned to detect environmental signals that preceded catastrophe. What makes this evidence particularly profound is that it connects all the other pieces. The artifacts sealed in coal told us someone came before. The cycles in ice cores showed when the world reset. The flood myths preserved memory of what survivors witnessed. The drowned cities proved that coastal civilizations were destroyed. And now, genetic markers confirm that humans who lived through those events were changed biologically, at the deepest level of what makes us human. The catastrophe was so severe that it left permanent traces in the genome, adaptations persisting thousands of years later because they represent the difference between lineages that survived and lineages that perished. The most unsettling aspect is the activation pattern in recent generations. The catastrophe survival genes are responding to current conditions, turning on in ways suggesting the human genome is detecting early warning signals. The genes are activating. The biological warning system is responding, and what it is telling us is that conditions are shifting toward the state where catastrophe survival traits become necessary rather than optional. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about memory itself. The genome represents a different kind of memory, older and more durable, encoding not the details of what happened, but the essential adaptations needed when it happens again. Your catastrophe survival genes do not tell you what your ancestors saw. They give you the tools to survive what your ancestors survived. Do you feel it now? The weight of carrying genetic memory from people who watched the world end? The markers are not abstract data points. They are messages written in your cells, instructions from ancestors who survived the unsurvivable. If this evidence is changing how you understand your place in the larger pattern, then help this investigation reach others who carry the same inheritance. Leave a like on this video. Share this chapter with someone who needs to understand what the genetic code is revealing. Because what comes next takes us from evidence written in your body to evidence written in stone, from genetic memory to architectural legacy. We have seen the pattern in ice, in myth, in drowned cities, in DNA. Now we examine the giants in stone, the megalithic structures that should not exist according to the accepted timeline, that require knowledge survivors carried forward from before the flood and used to create monuments so massive they could not be erased, so precise they could not be primitive, so aligned with celestial cycles they could not be accidental. The genetic code told us who survived. The monuments will show us what they tried to preserve. Stay with me as we stand at the base of impossibilities. The investigation deepens. The next mystery awaits. Chapter 6. The Giants in Stone. Monuments that shouldn't exist. You are standing at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, your hand pressed against limestone blocks weighing 15 tons each.
2.3 million stones stacked with precision that a knife blade cannot slide between them. The surface you touch is rough now, weathered by 45 centuries of wind and sand, but beneath the damaged outer layer, you can feel the accuracy, the flatness, speaking of cutting and shaping with tools and techniques that, according to every textbook, should not have existed when this structure was built. You walk the perimeter, measuring angles. The base is level to within fractions of an inch across more than 13 acres. The sides are aligned to true north, with accuracy that would be impressive using modern surveying equipment, and is inexplicable for a culture supposedly working with copper tools and no magnetic compasses. The precision is not decorative. It is fundamental to the structure itself. The ratio of the pyramid's height to its base perimeter approximates pi to 4 decimal places. The internal passages align with specific stars, not their current positions, but their positions thousands of years ago, as if the builders understood precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, shifting the apparent location of stars over 26,000-year cycles. You enter through the narrow, descending passage, the air inside cool and still, and as you move deeper, you feel the weight above you, millions of tons held in place by engineering requiring understanding of stress distribution and load-bearing. The Grand Gallery rises at a precise angle, its corbelled ceiling a masterpiece where each layer projects slightly beyond the one below, creating a vault without mortar or metal reinforcement. At the end, you reach the King's Chamber, constructed from granite blocks weighing 50 to 80 tons each, quarried 500 miles away, transported by methods that remain unexplained, then lifted to over 100 feet and positioned with tolerances measured in millimeters. The mainstream explanation holds that this was accomplished using copper tools, wooden rollers, rope, and tens of thousands of workers. But when you examine saw marks visible in blocks, when you measure the precision of right angles and flatness of surfaces, the official story feels incomplete. Something is missing. Some technique or inherited knowledge that made this construction possible. Knowledge that feels less like invention and more like inheritance from something older. For generations, mainstream archaeology has treated great monuments as evolutionary endpoints, structures representing the culmination of steady technological progress. The pyramids of Egypt are understood as tombs for pharaohs, built during the Old Kingdom by increasingly sophisticated construction techniques. The megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru are attributed to Inca engineering. The complex of Teotihuacan in Mexico is seen as achievement of early Mesoamerican culture.
Each monument is placed within a clear timeline, given an origin story fitting the accepted progression from simple to complex. This narrative is supported by archaeological evidence. Pottery shards and organic materials found around monuments can be radiocarbon dated, providing ages confirming structures were built during claimed periods. Construction methods are inferred from examination of stones, from analysis of tool marks, from experiments where modern researchers attempt to replicate ancient techniques. And in many cases, these experiments succeed. Researchers can move large stones using wooden rollers and teams of people. They can shape granite using copper saws and sand as abrasive. The basic techniques work, which supports the conclusion that ancient peoples built the monuments we see today. But this explanation struggles with specific details. The pyramids show a strange pattern where the oldest structures are most precisely built, with the Great Pyramid representing peak accuracy, and later pyramids showing declining quality,
as if knowledge needed for precision was being lost rather than improved. This is the opposite of what evolutionary progress predicts. At Sacsayhuaman, foundation stones are enormous irregular polygons, fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed, and joints remain tight after 500 years of earthquakes, while upper layers added by the historical Inca are smaller regular blocks with visible gaps, clearly inferior work despite being built later. At sites around the world, the oldest megalithic layers consistently show higher precision than newer additions. The stones are larger, cuts more accurate, astronomical alignments more sophisticated. Modern engineers studying these monuments find details that deepen the mystery. Laser scanning of the Great Pyramid reveals that its base deviates from perfect level by less than 1 inch across 750 feet. A tolerance challenging contemporary construction standards. The sides are slightly concaved, curving inward by approximately 1 foot, a feature demonstrating that builders could execute complex three-dimensional geometry at monumental scale. The internal passages maintain their angles with precision measured in arc minutes, requiring calculation and surveying capabilities that experiments attempting to replicate using proposed ancient methods consistently fall short of achieving. At Sacsayhuaman, detailed analysis reveals that massive polygonal stones are not simply fitted at visible surfaces, but interconnected through complex three-dimensional joints extending deep into the wall, creating interlocking networks, providing structural stability, allowing walls to flex during earthquakes without collapsing. This earthquake-resistant engineering requires understanding seismic principles that supposedly did not develop until modern times. The surfaces where stones meet show no evidence of trial and error, no witness marks from repositioning. The stones appear shaped to fit perfectly on the first attempt. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, H-shaped blocks weighing over 100 tons are fashioned from andesite, with precisely cut grooves and drill holes showing smooth interior surfaces and perfect right angles. The drill holes go straight down with uniform diameter and no wobble, characteristics suggesting rotary drilling with rigid bits made of material harder than the stone being cut. Copper and bronze cannot drill andesite. The astronomical alignments present their own puzzles. At Teotihuacan, the layout mirrors orbital distances of planets in the solar system when mapped to scale. The Avenue of the Dead is aligned to a specific azimuth corresponding to the setting point of the Pleiades at a date roughly 12,000 years ago. The Sphinx shows water erosion patterns that geologists date to periods of heavy rainfall existing 9,000 to 12,000 years ago, not 4,500 years ago when officially dated. The Great Pyramid's internal passages align with stars as they appeared thousands of years earlier than the Fourth Dynasty. Multiple sites show construction in layers, with oldest foundations using megalithic techniques and astronomical knowledge exceeding what later cultures demonstrated. In 1993, Robert Bauval published research proposing that the layout of the three Giza pyramids matched the pattern of stars in Orion's belt, and that alignment was most accurate when calculated for a date around 10,500 BCE. His Orion correlation theory generated controversy. Critics argued the match was approximate. Bauval responded with detailed astronomical calculations showing the correlation was precise. The debate became heated, but Bauval's academic career did not advance. His work was categorized as alternative history, discussed in popular books but ignored by mainstream Egyptology. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, examined the Sphinx and concluded that erosion patterns on limestone walls were caused by water, not wind and sand. Water erosion requires periods of substantial rainfall, conditions existing during the African humid period, but ending around 5000 BCE. If the Sphinx enclosure was carved during a period of heavy rain, it must be older than conventional dating allows. Schoch published findings in peer-reviewed geology journals. The evidence was solid by geological standards. But Egyptologists rejected the conclusion, arguing that conventional dating based on stylistic analysis was more reliable than geological interpretation. Graham Hancock documented megalithic sites around the world, noting patterns of precision in oldest layers, astronomical alignments pointing to dates far earlier than official construction dates. His books became bestsellers, reaching millions with evidence mainstream archaeology preferred to ignore. The academic response was dismissive. Hancock was labeled a pseudoscientist, his arguments refuted, not by engaging with evidence but by attacking his credentials. The pattern repeated with other researchers. John Anthony West worked with Schoch on Sphinx dating. Robert Temple studied astronomical knowledge encoded in monuments. Andrew Collins investigated structures predating accepted chronologies. All were marginalized, their work excluded from academic conferences, their findings discussed only in alternative media. The suppression was not coordinated conspiracy, but systemic protection of established narratives. Archaeology is built on timelines developed over more than a century. Accepting that oldest megalithic structures might be far older would require revising enormous amounts of established scholarship. Careers are built on the existing framework. When evidence threatens the framework, the instinctive response is to defend, to dismiss, to explain away. The giants in stone are not simply impressive architecture. They are messages encoded in the most durable medium available to people who understood that everything else would be destroyed, that knowledge recorded on papyrus or clay would corrode and crumble, but stone, weighing hundreds of tons, positioned with astronomical precision, might survive long enough to tell future generations that someone came before, that cycles of destruction separated ages of achievement. The precision is the message. The fact that the Great Pyramid encodes pi and phi and aligns with true north to fractions of a degree is deliberate. A way of saying to whoever eventually develops the mathematics to measure these things that the builders possessed that knowledge first. The astronomical alignments are the message. The fact that monuments on different continents point to the same ancient date is not worship of stars, but a timestamp, marking when the knowledge originated, when the catastrophe occurred, when survivors began rebuilding. The degradation of technique over time tells another part of the message. The oldest layers are best built, not because later cultures were less capable, but because they were working from incomplete information, trying to replicate achievements whose underlying principles were no longer fully understood. The survivors who built the foundations possessed knowledge inherited from before the flood. They passed what they could to the next generation, and each generation after retained less. Perhaps the most profound message is about impermanence and survival. These monuments represent enormous investment undertaken by cultures that must have been stable and sophisticated. Yet those cultures are gone. Everything they built, except the largest stones, has been destroyed. What survived were monuments too massive to erase, too precisely built to dismiss as primitive, too clearly aligned to be accidental. And those monuments are trying to tell us that the Earth operates on cycles that do not care about human achievement. Are you beginning to see these structures differently now, not as primitive achievements, but as inheritances from something older? Messages encoded by survivors who understood that everything else would be lost when the next cycle turned. The precision is not showing off. The astronomical alignments are not decorative. These monuments were built to communicate across time, to tell whoever came after that knowledge existed before, that the world has ended and restarted multiple times, that survival depends on recognizing the pattern before it completes. If this evidence is changing how you understand the monuments, then help this investigation reach others. Leave a like. Share this with someone who needs to understand that the past is not what we have been taught. Because what comes next brings all the evidence together into a comprehensive picture of what came before us. We have seen artifacts sealed in impossible time, cycles recorded in ice, flood myths preserving testimony, drowned cities proving those myths were real, genetic markers showing who survived, and now megalithic monuments encoding knowledge from before the collapse. The next chapter maps the 6 forgotten civilizations that rose and fell before ours. The pattern is almost complete. The evidence converges. And understanding what happened to them is the only way to see what is coming for us. Stay with me as we reconstruct the lost timeline. If we are the 7th civilization, what were the 6 that came before? The investigation reaches its climax. Chapter 7. The 6 Forgotten Worlds. Mapping the Lost Civilizations. You are looking at a map of Earth, but not the Earth you know, not the configuration of continents and coastlines that appears in modern atlases or satellite imagery, but Earth as it existed 15,000 years ago, before the ice sheets melted, before the oceans rose 400 feet, before the catastrophic transitions that drowned coastal plains and transformed fertile lowlands into deserts, and erased entire landscapes so completely that most people today have no idea they ever existed. The coastlines on this map extend hundreds of miles beyond their current positions. Southeast Asia is not a scattering of islands, but a vast landmass connecting Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam into a single continent larger than India. The Persian Gulf is dry land, with rivers flowing through valleys that are now underwater. The Mediterranean contains islands and coastal plains that have vanished beneath the waves. Between Alaska and Siberia stretches Beringia, a temperate grassland supporting megafauna and the human populations that hunted them. The Sahara is green, crisscrossed with rivers and dotted with lakes. The Amazon basin shows geometric patterns, suggesting landscape modification on scales that dwarf anything visible in the current jungle. Your finger traces these drowned lands, these vanished territories, and you try to imagine what they looked like when they were inhabited, when civilizations rose during the long, stable period of the Ice Age and built cities on coastal plains that are now continental shelves, when populations numbered in the millions across regions that no longer exist above water. The flood myths told you these lands were real. The ice cores showed you when they were drowned. The underwater ruins proved that structures exist exactly where the myths said lost cities would be. The genetic evidence demonstrated that survivors carried forward adaptations specific to catastrophe conditions. The megalithic monuments encoded knowledge that predated the cultures credited with building them. And now, this map, reconstructed from bathymetric data and geological surveys and ice core analysis, shows you where those earlier civilizations must have existed. The 6 forgotten worlds that rose and fell before ours, each one thriving during a stable period, each one destroyed when the cycle turned and the world reset with violence that left almost nothing behind except scattered survivors and fragments of memory. These are not theoretical reconstructions based on mythology or wishful thinking. These are data-driven models showing what Earth actually looked like when sea levels were lower, when climate patterns were different, when regions now hostile to human habitation were fertile and temperate and perfectly suited for complex societies. Geologists confirm that these landscapes existed. Climatologists confirm that conditions during the Ice Age were stable for thousands of years, long enough for civilizations to develop sophisticated cultures. Archaeologists find artifacts and structures in these regions that suggest human occupation far more extensive than official timelines acknowledge. And yet, mainstream science treats these drowned lands as empty territory, places where humans might have passed through during migrations, but never settled permanently, never built cities, never developed the kind of complexity that leaves archaeological signatures. The assumption is that civilization only began after the Ice Age ended, that everything before that moment was primitive nomadic existence, leaving no permanent mark. But the evidence tells a different story. The evidence says that during the 50,000-year stable period before the flood, when coastlines extended far beyond their current positions, humans did what humans always do when given stable conditions and abundant resources. They settled, they built, they organized. They created cultures sophisticated enough that when those cultures were destroyed, the survivors carried forward knowledge that became the foundation for what we call the first civilizations, the ones that arose after the flood, and that we mistakenly believe were the beginning rather than the continuation. The map in front of you is not complete. Much of what existed on these drowned lands has been erased by time and sedimentation, and the simple fact that oceans are difficult to explore, and funding for underwater archaeology is limited. But enough evidence survives, enough structures and artifacts and genetic traces and mythological memories, that the outlines of 6 major lost civilizations begin to emerge. 6 cultures that rose during the stable period, each in a region now transformed beyond recognition, each leaving behind fragments that point toward complexity we are only beginning to understand. You are about to trace those outlines, to map the forgotten worlds, to see what survived the catastrophe and what was lost forever. These are not the legendary Atlantis of Plato's imagination. These are real places that existed on real land that is now underwater or buried or transformed into desert. These are the 6 worlds that came before ours, and understanding what happened to them is the only way to understand what is coming for us, because we are building our civilization in the same vulnerable locations, depending on the same temporary stability, ignoring the same warning signs that preceded their destruction. The cycle is returning, the pattern is clear, and the fate of the 6 forgotten worlds is waiting to become the fate of the 7th, unless we learn from what the evidence is trying to teach us. The conventional understanding of human prehistory divides neatly into ages defined by tool technology and subsistence strategies. The Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, lasting from the emergence of tool use millions of years ago until around 12,000 years ago, is characterized as a period of small, nomadic bands using simple stone tools, hunting and gathering, leaving no permanent settlements, creating cave art in some regions, but building nothing that would survive millennia. The Neolithic, or New Stone Age, begins around 12,000 years ago with the development of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, followed by similar independent developments in China, Mesoamerica, and other regions. Agriculture enables permanent settlements. Permanent settlements grow into villages and then cities. Cities require organization and administration, leading to the development of writing, mathematics, specialized labor, and all the characteristics we associate with civilization. The timeline is clean. Hunter-gatherers become farmers. Farmers build cities. Cities create states. States develop into empires. And all of this happens within the last 12,000 years, with nothing before that moment qualifying as civilization in any meaningful sense. This narrative is supported by the archaeological record as it is conventionally interpreted. The earliest known cities, Jericho and Çatalhöyük, date to around 9 to 10,000 years ago. The first writing systems appear in Sumer around 5,000 years ago. Monumental architecture, like the Egyptian pyramids, dates to around 4,500 years ago. The pattern seems clear and progression logical. Before 12,000 years ago, humans were hunter-gatherers living in small groups, following game animals, leaving few traces. After 12,000 years ago, agriculture emerged, populations increased, complexity developed, and civilization began. The Ice Age is understood as a difficult period that limited human populations to small numbers in scattered refugia, regions where conditions remained tolerable while ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere. When the Ice Age ended and climates warmed, humans expanded into newly available territories and began the agricultural revolution that led to everything we call civilization. This framework is taught universally, repeated in textbooks, assumed in academic discourse,
and rarely questioned, except at the margins of acceptable scholarship. It has the virtue of simplicity and the weight of institutional consensus. It fits with evolutionary models that predict gradual development from simple to complex. It aligns with the visible archaeological record showing that the oldest permanent structures date to the Holocene, the current warm period that began 12,000 years ago. And it avoids uncomfortable questions about what might have existed before, about whether earlier warm periods during the Ice Age, and there were several spanning thousands of years each, might have supported complex societies that were destroyed when conditions shifted. The assumption is that humans, before the agricultural revolution, lacked the cognitive capacity, the social organization, or the environmental stability to create anything we would recognize as civilization. They were us, biologically, modern humans with brains identical to ours, but they lived as our distant ancestors lived, in small groups, moving frequently, building nothing permanent, leaving no legacy except the genes that eventually became us. But this comfortable narrative has cracks that widen when examined closely. The cognitive capacity of humans did not suddenly increase 12,000 years ago. Anatomically modern humans have existed for at least 200,000 years, possibly longer. Brain size and structure have been essentially identical for at least 50,000 years. There is no biological reason why humans living 15 or 20,000 years ago could not have developed complex societies if environmental conditions allowed. The social organization required for civilization is not unprecedented in human history. Even hunter-gatherer bands demonstrate sophisticated social structures, kinship systems, trade networks, and cooperative behaviors that rival anything seen in agricultural societies.
The environmental stability needed for civilization is exactly what the Ice Age provided during its long, stable periods. Between glacial advances, warm intervals lasting thousands of years created conditions as favorable as the current Holocene, and during those periods, humans occupied precisely the regions that are now drowned or buried or transformed. The coastal plains and river valleys and fertile lowlands that would have been perfect for settlement and development. The mainstream narrative assumes nothing significant happened during those stable periods, that humans remained primitive and nomadic, despite having identical brains and favorable conditions, and then suddenly, within a few thousand years of the Ice Age ending, they invented agriculture, built cities, and created civilization. The timing seems suspiciously convenient. The transition seems implausibly fast, and the assumption that nothing came before feels less like conclusion from evidence and more like assumption required to maintain a timeline that cannot accommodate earlier complexity. The first of the 6 forgotten worlds existed on what is now called Sundaland, the continental shelf connecting Southeast Asia into a single landmass during the Ice Age, when sea levels stood 400 feet lower than today. This region, roughly twice the size of India, contained river systems, inland seas, coastal plains, and fertile valleys perfectly suited for human habitation. Geologists estimate that Sundaland could have supported tens of millions of people if populations developed there during the 50,000-year stable period before the flood. When the Ice Age ended and meltwater poured into the oceans, this entire landmass disappeared beneath the waves over the course of several thousand years, drowning everything built upon it. Survivors would have fled inland to the mountains that became the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, carrying fragments of their coastal civilization into highland refugia. The flood myths of Southeast Asian cultures specifically describe lands that vanished beneath the ocean, cities that were swallowed by rising waters, ancestors who journeyed across ground that is now deep sea. These are not vague legends. They include geographical details, descriptions of rivers and coastlines, references to specific places that match the drowned topography visible in modern bathymetric surveys. Sonar scans of the Sunda Shelf reveal straight channels, rectangular depressions, and formations that resemble harbor installations, exactly what you would expect if maritime cultures built cities on this land before the ocean claimed it. The second forgotten world arose in what is now the Sahara Desert, but during the African humid period that lasted from roughly 15,000 to 5,000 years ago, this region was a green expanse filled with lakes, rivers, wetlands, and thriving ecosystems supporting large populations. Ancient rock art throughout the Sahara depicts boats, cattle, organized settlements, and complex social scenes showing cultures that were anything but primitive. Radar imaging from satellites reveals geometric patterns buried beneath the sand, shapes that suggest urban planning, agricultural systems, and infrastructure on scales that dwarf what later civilizations built in the region. When the climate shifted and the Sahara dried into desert, populations that numbered in the millions would have been forced to migrate, some moving north into the Mediterranean, others south into sub-Saharan Africa, carrying whatever knowledge they could preserve. The Green Sahara civilization may have been the bridge connecting early African, Mediterranean, and Near Eastern cultures, a hub of trade and innovation whose sudden collapse forced survivors to rebuild in marginal territories, creating the civilizations we recognize as the first, but which may actually have been inheritors of something older. The third forgotten world existed in Beringia, the landmass connecting Alaska and Siberia that is now submerged beneath the Bering Strait. During the Ice Age, Beringia was not a frozen wasteland, but a temperate steppe grassland supporting vast herds of mammoths, bison, horses, and other megafauna, along with the human populations that hunted them. The region was enormous, potentially larger than Texas, and remained ice-free even during glacial maxima. This was not merely a migration corridor used by people passing from Asia to America. This was a homeland where unique cultures could have developed in isolation for thousands of years, creating technologies suited to large animal management, cold climate survival, and maritime adaptation. When sea levels rose and Beringia drowned, those populations would have dispersed into Siberia and Alaska, and their genetic legacy, the catastrophe survival markers visible in northern populations, suggests they carried adaptations from a culture that faced and survived conditions of extreme challenge. The complete absence of archaeological evidence from Beringia is not surprising. The entire region is underwater, covered by sediments accumulated over 12,000 years, accessible only to the most advanced underwater survey equipment, and almost no funding exists for exploring a region that official timelines insist held nothing significant. The fourth forgotten world appears in the Indus Valley and surrounding regions of South Asia, where cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa show signs of sophisticated urban planning appearing almost fully formed around 5,000 years ago. But beneath these visible ruins, older layers suggest pre-existing cultures, foundations that the Indus Valley civilization built upon rather than created from nothing. The grid layouts, standardized bricks, advanced drainage systems, and uniform weights all suggest inherited knowledge rather than gradual invention. And the sudden appearance of this civilization, with no clear developmental precursors in the archaeological record, implies that it emerged from survivors of an earlier culture, possibly coastal populations displaced when the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea coastlines shifted during post-glacial flooding. The Indus Valley civilization itself collapsed around 4,000 years ago, possibly due to climate change or river shifts, demonstrating that even advanced urban societies are vulnerable when environmental conditions change faster than adaptation allows. The fifth forgotten world existed across the Mediterranean islands and coastal regions that are now either submerged or heavily modified by subsequent civilizations. During the Ice Age, the Mediterranean contained land bridges, islands, and coastal plains that no longer exist, creating a maritime network potentially supporting advanced seafaring cultures. The massive megalithic structures on Malta, Sardinia, Crete, and Cyprus, some of which predate the Egyptian pyramids, suggest cultures with sophisticated engineering knowledge and astronomical understanding. The sudden appearance of agricultural techniques and architectural styles in these regions after the flood, with no clear local precursors, implies that knowledge was carried forward from earlier coastal civilizations that were destroyed when sea levels rose and Mediterranean geography transformed. The collapse of these cultures coincides with volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and tsunamis that characterize periods of rapid geological change, the same forces that mark catastrophic transitions in ice core records. The sixth forgotten world lay beneath what is now the Amazon rainforest, a region that satellite LiDAR scans reveal contained sprawling networks of earthworks, causeways, geometric patterns, and agricultural modifications extending for hundreds of miles. These features suggest organized societies capable of landscape engineering at scales rivaling anything built in the Old World. Cultures that may have developed during warm, stable periods and specialized in biological rather than stone-based technologies, creating systems that worked with the jungle environment rather than against it. When climate patterns shifted, either through natural cycles or through human-caused deforestation, the collapse would have been swift, with jungle reclaiming agricultural land and burying structures under vegetation and soil. The survivors would have reverted to smaller-scale societies, carrying oral traditions describing ancestors who built cities and modified landscapes, traditions that persist in indigenous Amazonian cultures, despite being dismissed as mythology by outsiders who cannot imagine that the jungle ever contained anything but primitive villages. In 2018, archaeologists using LiDAR technology to peer through the Amazon canopy discovered extensive earthworks near the Bolivian city of Trinidad, geometric patterns and raised platforms, suggesting urban planning and agricultural infrastructure built by cultures predating the conventional timeline for complex Amazonian societies. The discovery challenged assumptions that the Amazon could not support large populations or sophisticated cultures before European contact. But funding for further exploration was limited. Access to many areas was restricted due to political instability and environmental regulations, and mainstream archaeology showed little interest in pursuing findings that would require rewriting South American prehistory. The researchers published their results, gave interviews explaining the significance, and then watched as the story faded from attention, filed away as interesting but not paradigm-changing, noted but not integrated into the broader understanding of human development. Similar patterns emerged with research into Sunderland. Marine geologists and archaeologists proposed comprehensive surveys of the Sunda Shelf to search for evidence of the coastal civilizations that flood myths describe. but securing funding and permissions from multiple Southeast Asian governments proved difficult. Small-scale surveys found anomalies, formations that warranted closer investigation, but systematic exploration never materialized. The few structures that were documented, stone arrangements on the seafloor off Thailand and Indonesia, were dismissed as natural formations, despite their geometric regularity. And researchers who insisted they showed signs of human modification found their work categorized as speculative rather than empirical. The Sahara presented different challenges. Satellite imagery clearly showed buried patterns beneath the sand, but ground-truthing those patterns required expeditions into politically unstable regions where safety could not be guaranteed and where local governments had no interest in supporting research that might complicate land ownership claims or development plans. The patterns remain visible from space, documented in academic papers, discussed in specialized conferences, but never investigated with the resources necessary to determine definitively whether they represent natural formations or remnants of the Green Sahara civilization. The pattern of limited investigation is not coincidental. These 6 regions, the drowned lands and transformed landscapes that may hold evidence of pre-flood civilizations, all share characteristics that make serious archaeological work difficult. They are underwater, requiring expensive specialized equipment and trained personnel. They are buried under sediment or vegetation or sand, requiring excavation on scales that dwarf typical archaeological projects. They are located in regions with complex political situations, where governments may not prioritize or may actively discourage research that challenges national narratives or complicates territorial claims. And most importantly, they represent topics that mainstream archaeology considers settled. The timeline is established. Civilization began 12,000 years ago. Anything suggesting otherwise is extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence, and the burden of proof is set so high that no amount of anomalous data is sufficient to force reconsideration. So the 6 forgotten worlds remain forgotten, not because evidence of their existence is absent, but because the institutional framework for investigating that evidence does not exist, because careers are built on the established timeline rather than on challenging it, and because the implications of accepting that 6 civilizations rose and fell before ours are too uncomfortable for societies that prefer to believe we represent unprecedented achievement rather than the latest iteration in a cycle that has repeated many times and will repeat again. The final evidence for the 6 forgotten worlds comes not from any single archaeological site, but from the convergence of all the evidence presented in previous chapters. The artifacts sealed in coal indicate someone reached technological sophistication millions of years ago, far earlier than the 6 forgotten worlds, suggesting the cycle extends much deeper into time than even this investigation has traced. The ice cores show catastrophic transitions repeating every 90 to 100,000 years, enough time for multiple civilizations to rise and fall between resets. The flood myths from every continent describe the same event 12,000 years ago, the moment when the 6 worlds were destroyed and survivors scattered to rebuild. The underwater structures rest exactly where drowned coastlines would have supported cities. The genetic markers appear in populations whose ancestors survived conditions requiring specialized adaptations. The megalithic monuments encode knowledge that predates the cultures credited with building them, knowledge that survivors carried forward from before the catastrophe. And the geographic distribution of all these traces maps directly onto the 6 regions where forgotten worlds could have existed, the places where stable conditions met favorable environments, met human populations that had 50,000 years to develop complexity before the cycle turned and the world reset. The evidence is not isolated anomalies. The evidence is a coherent pattern pointing to the same conclusion from multiple independent lines of investigation. 6 civilizations rose before ours. 6 civilizations were destroyed, and we are the 7th, standing at the same threshold, facing the same forces, blind to the pattern because we refuse to see what the evidence is showing us. If this interpretation is correct, if Earth has indeed hosted 6 major civilizations before our own, then the most important question is not whether they existed, but what their existence means for us. The first lesson is humility. We are not special. We are not the first to reach this level of complexity. We are not unprecedented. Every achievement we celebrate, every technology we develop, every structure we build, someone before us likely accomplished something similar during their own stable period, and it was not enough to save them when the cycle turned. The second lesson is fragility. Advancement does not guarantee survival. Complexity does not provide immunity from geological and astronomical forces operating on timescales that make human civilizations feel like insects living for a single day. The 6 worlds that came before us reached heights we can only reconstruct from fragments, and those heights did not prevent their destruction when ice melted or volcanoes erupted or climates shifted or whatever combination of catastrophic events marked the end of their stable periods. The third lesson is about knowledge and how it survives. Physical structures, even massive stone monuments, deteriorate and are buried and eventually forgotten. Written records corrode or burn or are lost when the cultures that created them collapse. Technologies that depend on complex supply chains and specialized expertise disappear when those chains break and that expertise is not passed forward. What survives catastrophic transitions is not the sophistication of a civilization, but the durability of what it encodes in forms that can outlast the catastrophe. The survivors of the 6 forgotten worlds carried forward fragments, genetic adaptations, oral traditions, techniques for working stone and aligning structures with stars, mathematical constants embedded in monument proportions, memories compressed into myths that preserved warnings about flood and darkness and the need to prepare. These fragments became the seeds from which post-flood civilizations grew, explaining why sophisticated knowledge appears suddenly in the archaeological record, why the oldest structures are often the most precisely built, why cultures separated by oceans share similar flood stories and similar astronomical understanding. They were not inventing from nothing. They were remembering, reconstructing, rediscovering what their ancestors knew before the world ended. The fourth, and perhaps most critical lesson, is about cycles and what they mean for our future. If the pattern is real, if catastrophic resets occur with rhythmic regularity visible in ice cores and sediment layers, if 6 civilizations before ours rose during stable periods and were destroyed when those periods ended, then the question facing us is simple and terrifying. When does our stable period end? The ice cores suggest that warm interglacial periods last roughly 10 to 12,000 years before transitioning back to glacial conditions. We are 12,000 years into the current warm period. The magnetic field is weakening. Ice sheets are destabilizing. Climate patterns are shifting. Ocean currents are slowing. The signs that preceded past transitions are appearing again. Whether the next transition happens in decades or centuries or millennia is uncertain, but the geological record suggests it is overdue, and the 6 forgotten worlds stand as warnings that no civilization, regardless of its achievements, survives when the planet shifts from one state to another. We are building in the same vulnerable coastal zones. We are depending on the same climate stability. We are ignoring the same warning signs. And the cycle, patient and implacable, is turning once again. Can you see them now? The 6 forgotten worlds sleeping beneath oceans and sand and jungle, their names lost, their achievements erased, their voices reaching forward through myth and monument and genetic code to tell us that we are not the first and that their fate will be our fate unless we learn from the pattern they left behind. If this investigation has changed how you understand human history, if you recognize that the official timeline is incomplete and that the evidence points towards something far older and far more cyclical than we have been taught, then help this reach the people who need to hear it before the next transition begins. Leave a like. Share this final chapter. Let others know that the 6 worlds existed, that they fell, and that we are the 7th, standing at the edge of the same abyss they faced. Your engagement is what allows truth to survive in a system designed to bury inconvenient evidence. This is not the end of the investigation. This is the beginning of understanding. We have traced the pattern across ice cores and flood myths, underwater ruins and genetic markers, megalithic monuments, and drowned coastlines. We have mapped the 6 civilizations that rose before ours, and seen how each was destroyed when the world reset. And now the question turns from what happened to them to what is happening to us. The signs are gathering. The cycle is turning. The 8th civilization is beginning to form in the cracks of the 7th. And whether that 8th civilization survives or joins the forgotten worlds beneath the waves depends on whether enough people recognize the pattern before it completes. The evidence is here. The warning is clear. The choice is ours. Thank you for walking this journey with me through the echoes of lost worlds and the warnings written in stone and water, and the patient memory of a planet that has seen all of this before. The investigation continues. The pattern persists. And the truth, however uncomfortable, is what we need most as the stable period ends and the cycle begins again. Until we meet in the next inquiry, rest well and remember what the 6 worlds are trying to tell us. Nothing lasts, everything ends, and survival depends on those who see the pattern before the darkness returns.